There is a site in southern England where archaeologists found a perfectly circular wooden structure buried beneath layers of peat, preserved so completely that the original timber still holds its grain, its texture, and in some places, traces of the tools that shaped it. The structure dates to around 2050 BC. That part is remarkable enough, but what stopped researchers cold was what they found at its center: a massive, upturned oak tree root, placed there deliberately, with the root system facing skyward, as though the builders had taken the entire concept of a tree, inverted it, and made it the heart of their monument. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows what ritual this served. Nobody knows who gave the order to drag a 4-ton root mass through marshland and position it with this degree of precision. The people who built it left no writing, no clear iconography, no surviving tradition that explains the choice. They just did it. And then the sea came in. The peat swallowed everything, and the monument sat undisturbed for 4,000 years, until a storm in 1998 stripped the beach back far enough that a local man noticed something unusual sticking out of the sand. That site is called Seahenge, and it is one of dozens of discoveries across Britain that refuse to fit neatly into what we thought we understood about ancient people. If you're new here, subscribe now, because this channel covers exactly this kind of history. The stories that don't make the textbooks. The finds that quietly rewrite what archaeologists believed for decades. We go deep, we go long, and we do not cut corners. Now, let's start from the beginning. Section 1. Seahenge and the mystery of the inverted world. The North Sea coastline of Norfolk is not a gentle place. It is a flat, grey, wind-scraped stretch of England where the land ends in a sullen negotiation with the water rather than any dramatic cliff or headland. The tides here are unpredictable. The beaches shift. Villages have fallen into the sea over centuries, swallowed without ceremony. It is the kind of coastline that makes you feel the impermanence of everything. In the summer of 1998, John Lorimer was walking that beach at home next the sea when he noticed something in the exposed tidal flat that he couldn't explain. Wooden posts, in a circle, dark with age, jutting from the sand. He reported it. Archaeologists came. And what they found beneath the peat and sand would take years to fully process. Seahenge, as it came to be known, was a Bronze Age timber circle approximately 7 meters in diameter. It consisted of 55 oak posts, each split in half lengthwise, with the flat interior faces turned inward to form a smooth, unbroken inner wall. The posts had been driven into the ground with their bark sides facing outward, the worked surfaces facing in, creating a deliberate visual effect from the interior, a ring of uniform timber forming a contained, circular space. The whole thing had been constructed rapidly. Dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating, confirmed that all the timber came from trees felled in the same year, likely the same season, probably spring of 2050 BC. This was not a construction project that unfolded over decades. This was a coordinated single event. Someone planned it, gathered the materials, organized the labor, and built the whole structure in what appears to have been a matter of weeks. But it is the center of Seahenge that poses the question nobody has answered satisfactorily. At the heart of the circle, weighing approximately 4 metric tons, was a massive oak stump. Not a post, not a carved feature. An entire inverted tree, root system facing up toward the sky, the sawn base pointing into the ground. It had been deliberately placed this way. The logistical effort required to achieve this, in the Bronze Age, without wheeled vehicles suited to marsh terrain, without steel tools, without modern lifting equipment, is extraordinary. The root mass alone would have required a team of people working in coordination to move across unstable ground and lower into a prepared pit. And yet they did it. The question is why? Why invert the tree? Why place it at the center? Why make it the focal point of a monument that was clearly built with enormous communal investment. Theories have emerged over the decades since the discovery. Some archaeologists have suggested the inverted tree represented a link between worlds, an axis between the realm of the living and whatever the Bronze Age people of Norfolk understood as the realm beyond. Trees, in many ancient cultures, are liminal objects, things that exist between earth and sky, between the visible and the invisible, rooted in the ground and reaching into the air. To invert a tree would be to invert that liminality, to make the roots face the sky and the crown face the underworld, to flip the entire symbolic vocabulary of the natural world. There is a word in Norse mythology, Yggdrasil, the world tree, which is sometimes described as growing downward from a celestial point, rather than upward from the ground. The idea of an inverted cosmological tree appears in several ancient traditions, but Seahenge predates Norse culture by more than 2,000 years. If there is a connection, it runs deeper than we have yet traced it. Other interpretations have focused on the practical. Some researchers have suggested the stump may have served as a platform for excarnation, the practice of exposing a body to the elements so that flesh decomposes before the bones are collected and formally interred. There are ethnographic parallels from other cultures for elevated platforms used in this way, and the inverted roots, if covered with hides or woven material, would have provided a naturally irregular, grippy surface elevated above the marshy ground. But this interpretation feels incomplete. It explains the function without explaining the form. You do not need to invert a 4-ton root mass to create an excarnation platform. A simple post would do. A flat wooden surface would do. The deliberate inversion, the specific choice to flip the tree so that its roots faced the sky, seems to carry intentional meaning beyond mere practicality. What Seahenge tells us with certainty is that the people who built it had sophisticated organizational capacity. Experimental archaeology has estimated that the construction required the labor of somewhere between 50 and 100 people working together over a period of several weeks. That is not a small community effort. That is a coordinated social project that required someone with authority to direct it, resources sufficient to feed a workforce while they were engaged in building rather than hunting or farming, and a community consensus strong enough that everyone agreed this was worth doing. This was not a spontaneous act. It was planned. And the plan was very specific about putting an upside-down tree in the middle. The discovery became controversial for reasons beyond the archaeological. When news of Seahenge spread, the site attracted considerable public attention. Pagans and Druids came to the beach to perform ceremonies. English Heritage and the Norfolk Archaeological Unit wanted to excavate and conserve the timbers before further erosion destroyed them. This created a confrontation that lasted months, with protesters physically placing themselves between archaeologists and the structure, arguing that removing the timbers would desecrate a sacred site. Eventually, the timbers were removed, conserved, and are now displayed at the Lynn Museum in King's Lynn. But the controversy revealed something important. People felt, instinctively, that this place meant something. Even without any tradition connecting modern observers to the original builders, something about Seahenge communicated sacredness across 4,000 years. The analysis of the timbers produced one further remarkable detail. Tool marks on the wood were studied carefully, and researchers were able to determine that the posts had been worked by at least 51 different bronze axes. This was not the work of a single craftsman or even a single workshop. Different tools from different hands all contributed to the same structure. The interpretation that has gained the most traction among archaeologists is that this was a communal monument in the fullest sense, not built by specialists, but by members of a community, each contributing their own tool, their own effort, their own portion of the completed whole. Seahenge was a community act, an act whose purpose remains, 4,000 years later, completely opaque to us. And that opacity is itself significant. We have a strong tendency to assume that ancient people were simpler than us, that their rituals and monuments served obvious functions we can decode with sufficient analysis. Seehenge resists that assumption. It is complex. It is deliberate. It is strange in ways that seem intentional. And it has refused, despite decades of study, to yield its meaning. We are looking at the work of minds as sophisticated as ours, operating within a worldview we cannot fully reconstruct. That is the true unsettling quality of Seehenge. Not the logistics, not the inversion, but the reminder that there were entire ways of understanding existence that have vanished so completely we cannot even approximate them. Section 2. The Antikythera Mechanism of Britain. The Nebra Sky. Disker's British Connections. Before we continue deeper into Britain's own anomalies, there is a detour worth taking, because one of the most extraordinary astronomical objects ever found in Bronze Age Europe has direct connections to Britain that are rarely discussed in popular accounts. The Nebra sky disk was found in 1999 by illegal treasure hunters near Nebra in Saxony-Anhalt, Germany. It is a bronze disk, approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, inlaid with gold, depicting what appears to be the night sky with remarkable astronomical precision. The disk shows the full moon or sun, a crescent moon, stars, and what is now identified as the Pleiades star cluster. There is also a curved arc along one edge, and fragments suggest there were originally two such arcs, positioned to indicate the angular difference between the summer and winter solstice sunrises on the local horizon. When you account for the latitude of Central Europe, these arcs are correct to within fractions of a degree. The disk dates to approximately 1600 BC. It is the oldest known realistic representation of the night sky in human history, and it was found not in Greece, not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, but in Northern Europe, in a culture we have traditionally characterized as pre-literate, pre-scientific, and fundamentally less advanced than the Mediterranean civilizations of the same period. Here is the British connection. The disk was found alongside bronze swords. When those swords were analyzed and their origins traced using isotope analysis, the tin component of the bronze was found to come from Cornwall. The same isotope signature appears in the disk itself, which means the raw materials for one of the most sophisticated astronomical instruments of the ancient Bronze Age came from the mines of southwestern England. This is not a trivial detail. Cornwall in 1600 BC was already deeply embedded in a European trade network that connected it to central Germany, to Scandinavia, to the Mediterranean, and beyond. British tin was a strategic resource in the Bronze Age in ways we do not always fully appreciate. Tin is the essential ingredient in bronze, and good tin deposits were relatively rare in Europe. The Cornish deposits were among the richest on the continent, which means that Bronze Age Britain was, in a very real sense, economically central to the entire network of European civilization at this period, and that network was moving ideas as well as metal. If the tin that went into the Nebra sky disk came from Cornwall, then the people who mined that tin were part of the same cultural exchange that produced the disk. They were connected, through trade, to people sophisticated enough to create an astronomical instrument accurate to fractions of a degree. Did that knowledge flow back westward? Did Bronze Age Cornish miners know things about the sky that we have not credited them with knowing? The question becomes more pointed when you look at what was happening in Britain at roughly the same time. At Stonehenge, the Sarsen stones were erected around 2500 BC, the blue stones somewhat earlier. The monument was continuously modified and elaborated for more than 1,000 years. During the period when the Nebra sky disk was being made and traded, Stonehenge was already ancient, already a millennium old, already standing in its iconic configuration. The people of Bronze Age Britain were not building Stonehenge anymore. They were using it, visiting it, treating it as a heritage site in the most literal sense. But Britain was producing other monuments during this period that suggest astronomical sophistication of a high order. The Callanish stones on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides are a megalithic complex whose layout has been analysed extensively for astronomical alignments. The main avenue of stones is oriented toward the rising of the moon at its most southerly point in the lunar cycle, an event called the major lunar standstill that occurs approximately every 18.6 years. The geometry of the Callanish complex is such that when the moon rises at its standstill point and passes over the hills of the Harris horizon, it appears to walk along the horizon before rising fully, creating a visual effect of extraordinary drama. At this moment, the moon, viewed from the center of the Callanish ring, appears to rise between the stones of the avenue and then set again shortly afterward, a phenomenon that lasts only a few years in each 18.6-year cycle. This is not an alignment that happens by chance. The builders of Callanish had to have observed the lunar standstill cycle across multiple generations to understand the pattern, planned the monument's orientation deliberately, and built the avenue precisely enough to frame the effect. None of this is simple. All of it points to generations of systematic sky observation, the transmission of astronomical knowledge across decades, and a community organized enough to act on that knowledge with major stone construction. The Nebra connection and the evidence of Callanish's lunar alignment suggests something that archaeologists have been increasingly willing to acknowledge in recent decades. Bronze Age and Neolithic Britain was not an astronomical backwater. It was a place where sky observation was sophisticated, organized, and important enough to drive the construction of monuments that have lasted 4,000 years. What we do not know is how that knowledge was recorded and transmitted. We have the monuments, we have the alignments, but we have no written tradition, no clear academic institution, no identifiable class of astronomers whose training we can trace. The knowledge existed. The mechanisms of its transmission are invisible to us. That invisibility is part of what makes these discoveries so persistently interesting. The knowledge was there. Where it came from, how it was maintained, and where it went when these cultures changed are questions we are still working to answer. Section 3. The Sweet Track and the Lost Roads of Britain. In 1970, a man named Ray Sweet was working a peat cutting machine in the Somerset levels when his equipment struck something solid. He stopped, investigated, and found wood. Old wood. Very old wood. What Ray Sweet had found, running in a near-perfectly straight line across approximately 2 kilometers of ancient fenland, was a Neolithic wooden trackway. It was constructed from planks of ash, oak, and lime, laid lengthwise and supported by pegs driven into the peat on either side. It was wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, and it was built, as radiocarbon and dendrochronological dating would later confirm, in the winter of 3807 BC, give or take a year. This is not an approximation. The dendrochronology of the Sweet Track is precise enough that researchers have identified the winter of 3807 BC as the construction season based on the growth rings of the felled timber. We know, to within a single year, when this road was built. And it is a road, not a path worn by repeated use, not a series of stepping stones, an engineered wooden road, planned, designed, and built to a consistent specification across 2 kilometers of difficult terrain. The builders calculated the route. They felled timber in sufficient quantities. They transported it to a fenland environment where the ground was unstable. They drove the pegs, laid the planks, and created a stable crossing. The Sweet Track is the oldest known road in Britain and one of the oldest engineered roads in the world. When it was built, the Egyptian civilization had not yet emerged. The first cities of Mesopotamia were barely beginning to coalesce. The wheel had not yet been invented in Europe. And in Somerset, people were building engineered wooden roads across swamps. The track was not used for long. The peat analysis suggests it was in active use for about a decade before rising water levels made the crossing impractical and the track was abandoned. In a sense, the brevity of its use is part of what preserved it so well. It was covered by peat before it had time to wear out or be dismantled for reuse. Objects found along the track provide glimpses of the people who walked it. A polished jadeite axe, visually perfect and unused, was found deliberately placed beside the track. Jadeite of this quality does not occur in Britain. It comes from the Alps, from deposits in what is now northern Italy. This axe had travelled across Europe, probably through successive exchanges over decades or centuries, and ended up placed reverently beside a wooden road in Somerset. Why? Was it an offering, a marker, a discarded prestige object? We do not know, but its presence confirms that the people who built the Sweet Track were part of the same European exchange network we encountered with the Nebradisca's Cornish tin. Ideas, objects and materials were moving across the continent with a regularity we have historically underestimated. The Sweet Track is not unique. The Somerset levels have yielded a series of Neolithic and Bronze Age trackways, including the older Post Track, which predates the Sweet Track by several hundred years, and many later examples. The region was repeatedly traversed by engineered wooden roads across thousands of years, suggesting that the crossing of this particular stretch of fenland was economically and socially important enough to justify repeated major engineering investment. There is also something deeply practical and deeply humanizing about the Sweet Track that gets lost when it is discussed purely in terms of archaeology. Someone had an idea. They looked at 2 kilometers of waterlogged, unstable fenland and thought, we can cross this. We can build something that lets us move across this reliably, in all weathers, carrying loads. And they organized the labor, felled the trees in winter when the sap was down and the wood would last, transported everything to the site, and built it. That is problem solving. That is engineering. That is the application of technical knowledge and organizational capacity to a practical challenge. And it happened in Somerset nearly 6,000 years ago. The Sweet Track forces a reckoning with the limits of what we mean by the word primitive. These people had no writing. They had no metal tools. The track predates the Bronze Age in Britain. They lived in ways that, compared to modern life, appear very simple. But they were not simple thinkers. They were not simple problem solvers. And the road they built, which lasted 10 years before the water rose to cover it, has now lasted 6,000 years in the peat. In its way, that is a kind of permanence they never intended and could not have foreseen. Section 4. Göbekli Tepe's Northern Echo. The stone circles that predate explanation. Most people, when they hear about ancient stone circles in Britain, think of Stonehenge. Stonehenge is magnificent, and we will get to it in detail. But Stonehenge is, in the broader context of British prehistoric monument building, relatively late. The tradition of erecting large stones in deliberate arrangements in Britain goes back much further and is far more widespread than the famous Wiltshire monument suggests. There are estimated to be over 1,000 stone circles in Britain and Ireland. They range from the enormous, like the Avebury Henge in Wiltshire, which encloses the largest stone circle in the world by area, to the modest, like the hundreds of small rings in upland moorland across Scotland, Wales, and the north of England. They span a period from roughly 3000 BC to 1500 BC, though some may be earlier. What they have in common, beyond the obvious formal quality of standing stones arranged in a ring, is that they are almost all astronomically aligned in ways that suggest deliberate intent. Almost all of them have sightlines toward significant solar or lunar events. Sunrise at the solstices, sunset at the equinoxes, the rising or setting of particular stars. In some cases, The alignments are precise enough to allow specific dates in the ritual or agricultural calendar to be marked by the play of light through the stones. But the stone circles of Britain present a puzzle that goes beyond alignment. In 2020, archaeological work at a site called Warn Morn in the Preseli Hills of Wales produced a discovery that fundamentally changed the conversation about Stonehenge and about British prehistoric monument building more broadly. Warn Morn is a dismantled stone circle. Most of its stones are gone, fallen, or removed, but the holes where they once stood are clearly visible as pits in the soil. When archaeologists measured the diameter of the original circle and compared it to the bluestone setting at Stonehenge, the numbers matched almost exactly. And when they analysed the stone types at Warn Morn and compared them to the bluestones of Stonehenge, they found direct geological matches. The implication of this was startling. Stonehenge's bluestones did not just come from the Preseli Hills in general. Some of them appear to have come from Warn Morn specifically, transported from the stone circle in Wales and reinstalled at Stonehenge. The monument at Stonehenge, in other words, may partially incorporate a dismantled earlier monument from Wales. This raises an obvious question. Why would people dismantle a stone circle and move it 200 miles? One interpretation, developed by archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson and his team, is that the people who moved to Salisbury Plain, perhaps as part of a migration or cultural shift, brought their sacred monument with them. The stones of Warn Morn were not just building material, they were the stones of their place, their sacred landscape, their community's ritual geography. To move the stones was to move the place, to reconstitute the sacred in a new location. If this is correct, then Stonehenge is not merely a monument. It is a monument built partly from another monument, carrying within it the physical substance of an older, geographically distant sacred site. It is a layering of meaning across both time and space that we are only beginning to appreciate. But the Preseli Hills connection goes deeper still. The bluestones of Stonehenge are not a single geological type. They come from multiple specific quarry sites in the Preseli Hills, each identified precisely by geochemical analysis. The quarries at Carn Godog and Rossifellin have been excavated, and the evidence of systematic quarrying, extraction, and preparation of stone has been documented. There are traces of wedge holes, of prepared surfaces, of the controlled fracture techniques used to detach workable pieces from the parent rock. And crucially, the quarrying at these sites appears to date to around 3400 to 3200 BC, which means the stones were extracted from their quarries roughly 4 to 5 centuries before they were erected at Stonehenge. They sat somewhere, unused, for centuries before they were moved. Where did they sit? Why did they wait? What intervening history connects the quarrying to the final transport and erection? These are questions that remain open, but the timeline alone forces a rethinking of how we imagine Neolithic monument building. This was not a project executed by a single generation with a single plan. It was a project that unfolded across centuries, with the stones existing as important objects, perhaps even as sacred objects in themselves, long before they found their final positions. The stone itself mattered, not just the arrangement. The particular stone, from the particular place, carried meaning that made it worth quarrying, transporting, holding, and eventually moving again and again across generations and hundreds of miles. This is an idea of material sacredness, of the intrinsic significance of specific physical objects, that is quite foreign to how we typically think about construction projects. We think of building materials as fungible. Stone is stone. But for the builders of Stonehenge, this specific stone, from this specific outcrop in this specific hill in Wales, was the right stone, and no other would do. That level of specificity across hundreds of miles of transport, across possibly centuries of waiting, suggests a richness of tradition and a depth of communal memory that we are still struggling to fully appreciate. Section 5. The Megalithic Yard and the Question of a Prehistoric Standard. In 1955, an engineer and amateur archaeologist named Alexander Thom began publishing papers based on decades of painstaking measurement of stone circles across Britain and France. Thom had spent years visiting sites, measuring them with engineering precision, and analyzing the dimensions of hundreds of monuments. His conclusion, which he laid out in a series of increasingly rigorous papers, and eventually in 2 books, was that the builders of British megalithic monuments had used a standard unit of measurement. He called it the megalithic yard. The megalithic yard, as Thom calculated it, was approximately 0.8296 meters, or just under 2 feet and 9 inches. He claimed to have identified this unit across hundreds of sites in Britain and France, arguing that the consistency could not be coincidental and must reflect a deliberately maintained standard transmitted across vast distances and long periods of time. The academic reception was mixed, to put it diplomatically. Some archaeologists were skeptical of both Thom's methodology and his conclusions. Statistical analyses of his data have been conducted and disputed multiple times over the decades since. The debate has never been definitively resolved, but here is why the idea refuses to go away. If the megalithic yard is real, if Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain had a standard unit of measurement maintained with sufficient consistency to show up in stone circles from the Outer Hebrides to Brittany, then we are looking at evidence of something extraordinary. Not just surveying skill and mathematical knowledge, which are already remarkable, but a system of knowledge transmission, a way of passing the standard from person to person, generation to generation, community to community, that preserved it accurately enough to be identified 4,000 years later by an engineer with a theodolite. You cannot transmit a measurement standard without some mechanism. In the modern world, we have physical standards, the International Prototype Kilogram in Paris, the cesium atom clock defining the second. We have documents, calibration procedures, institutional infrastructure. The Neolithic builders of Britain had none of these things, or at least none that have survived. So how, if Thom is right, did they do it? One answer involves the human body. A number of researchers have pointed out that the megalithic yard is close to a common double step length for a person of average height, walking at a natural pace. The unit might have been maintained not by reference to an external standard, but by reference to the body itself, calibrated generation by generation through practice and training. This is how many pre-modern measurement systems worked. The foot, the cubit, the yard all derive ultimately from body proportions. If this is the mechanism, then the megalithic yard tells us something about the continuity of practice, about communities of people who built monuments regularly enough that their measurement practices remained consistent across generations. It is evidence not of a central authority imposing standards from above, but of a living tradition of construction practice that reproduced itself through apprenticeship and use. The other possibility, the one that makes archaeologists most uncomfortable, is that there was some form of systematic communication between monument-building communities across Britain and France, something organized enough to maintain measurement consistency over hundreds of miles and hundreds of years. This would imply a level of social coordination that we have not traditionally attributed to Neolithic Europe. There is one further observation that Thom made which has proven particularly durable. He noticed that many megalithic rings are not circles in the strict geometric sense. They are ellipses, eggs, flattened circles, and compound curves built from multiple circle arcs with different centers and radii. And in many cases, the geometry of these non-circular rings uses Pythagorean relationships. That is, right triangles with integer sides in the ratios of 3, 4, 5 or 5, 12, 13 to define the shape. The Pythagorean theorem was not formulated in the West until Pythagoras of Samos in the 6th century BC, but the relationships it describes, the proportional relationships between the sides of right triangles, are mathematical truths that do not require the theorem to be discovered to be used. Builders can use rope and peg geometry to create right angles and Pythagorean proportions empirically, without ever stating the underlying theorem. And Tom's data suggests that's exactly what the builders of British megalithic monuments were doing. Constructing sophisticated geometric shapes using empirical right triangle geometry, achieving results that would not be formally theorized for another 2,000 years. The stones are still there, the geometry is still there, and whether or not the megalithic yard turns out to be exactly as Tom described it, the geometric sophistication of the monuments themselves is not seriously in dispute. These were people who knew things about geometry, and they applied that knowledge to stone, on a hillside, 4,000 years before the name Pythagoras was attached to the theorem they were using. Section 6. The tomb that predates Stonehenge. Newgrange and its British echoes. Newgrange is in Ireland, not Britain, and this documentary is about Britain. But Newgrange cannot be ignored, because it is both the most dramatic single example of Neolithic astronomical engineering in the British Isles and a monument that was built within the same cultural network that produced many of Britain's most mysterious sites. Newgrange was built around 3200 BC, making it older than Stonehenge by roughly 600 years. It is a passage tomb, a large circular mound with an internal chamber reached by a long stone passage. The mound is 60 meters in diameter and 13 meters high, faced with quartz and granite stones that have been restored to something approaching their original gleaming appearance. Once a year, at the winter solstice, something happens inside Newgrange that its builders arranged with extraordinary precision. At sunrise, on the morning of the solstice, light enters through a specially constructed box above the main entrance and travels along the 19-meter passage to illuminate the chamber at the very back of the monument. For approximately 17 minutes, the chamber, which is in complete darkness for the rest of the year, is filled with light. The roof box, the structure that admits this specific beam, is oriented with a precision that accounts for the exact geometry of the sunrise on the solstice morning at this latitude. The builders had to have observed the sunrise position over multiple years, understood the mathematical relationship between the sun's declination and its rising position on the horizon, and designed and built a stone structure that captured that relationship precisely. This is not approximate. The light enters the passage and reaches the back chamber. The alignment works. Newgrange is the most famous, but there are echoes of this kind of solar engineering across Britain itself. At Maeshowe in Orkney, a passage tomb of similar construction to Newgrange and roughly contemporary with it. The entrance passage is aligned so that the light of the setting sun at the winter solstice illuminates the back wall of the chamber. The effect is less dramatic than Newgrange, but the engineering principle is identical. A deliberately aligned stone passage that connects the interior of a burial monument to a specific solar event. At Bryn Celyn on Anglesey in Wales, another passage tomb, the alignment is to the sunrise on the summer solstice rather than the winter. The logic appears similar. The interior of the monument, the space reserved for the bones of the dead and for whatever rituals surrounded them, is connected to the cycle of the sun at its most extreme and most symbolically loaded moments. What does this tell us? It tells us first that Neolithic people, across a vast geographical range, were engaged in the same intellectual project, aligning the spaces of the dead with the movements of the sun. This is not coincidental. It reflects a widely shared cosmological belief system in which the relationship between the living and the dead, between the interior sacred space and the exterior solar event, was fundamental. It tells us, second, that the engineering capacity to achieve these alignments existed across the British Isles before 3000 BC, before Stonehenge, before the Bronze Age. In cultures that left no writing and no explicit account of their beliefs, people were building monuments whose orientation was calculated across years of observation and implemented with the precision of surveyors. And it tells us, third, that we should take very seriously the possibility that Neolithic people possessed a systematic body of astronomical knowledge, maintained and transmitted in ways we cannot fully reconstruct, that allowed them to predict and frame solar and lunar events with consistent accuracy. The scale of this knowledge transmission is hard to overstate. Newgrange in Ireland and Maeshowe in Orkney are roughly 600 miles apart. Both are aligned to solar events. Both use the same basic architectural principle of a stone passage designed to admit a specific beam of light at a specific moment. Were the builders in direct contact? Did they share a common tradition that spread across the British Isles? Or did they independently arrive at similar solutions to similar problems? We do not know. What we know is that they built it, and what they built still works. Section 7. The Roman Mystery. Things Rome left behind that shouldn't be there. The Romans occupied Britain from AD 43 to roughly AD 410, a period of nearly 4 centuries. In that time they built roads, fortifications, towns, villas, baths, temples, and a great deal of civilian and military infrastructure. Roman Britain is one of the best documented archaeological periods in the country's history, with extensive written records, extensive physical remains, and a long tradition of scholarly study. And yet, Roman Britain keeps producing discoveries that don't fit the expected pattern. In 1992, during construction work in Southwark, South London, a pit was discovered that contained a collection of objects so unusual that it took years of analysis to begin to understand what it might represent. Among the finds were Roman artifacts mixed with much earlier prehistoric material, a combination that raised immediate questions. Then, at the bottom of the pit, archaeologists found something that had no obvious explanation. A small bronze object that appeared to be a mechanical device. The object was a small dodecahedron, a 12-sided hollow bronze structure with circular holes of varying sizes on each face and small knobs at each vertex. It was, in other words, a Roman dodecahedron, one of approximately 100 such objects found across the former Roman Empire, almost all of them from the northwestern provinces, including Britain, Gaul, and Germania. Nobody knows what Roman dodecahedra were for. This is not a minor unsolved question in a marginal field. Dodecahedra have been found across Britain and northern Europe for centuries, and every serious attempt to identify their function has ended in uncertainty. They are not mentioned in any Roman text. There are no images of them in Roman art. There are no inscriptions referring to them. They appear to have been deliberately not recorded in writing, which is itself remarkable for a culture as thoroughly documented as Rome. Proposed functions include surveying instruments, rangefinders for artillery, knitting needle gauges, candlestick holders, religious objects, dice, and astronomical instruments for calculating planting dates based on the sun's declination. None of these explanations has been demonstrated conclusively, and several have been fairly definitively ruled out. What makes the dodecahedra particularly interesting in the context of Britain is their distribution. They are found predominantly in the northwestern provinces, Britain, Gaul, Germany, and the Low Countries. They are almost entirely absent from Italy, Greece, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, areas that were central to Roman civilization and much better documented in the historical record. This geographical pattern suggests the dodecahedra were associated with something specific to the northern provinces, something cultural or functional that existed there and not in the Mediterranean heartland of the empire. One hypothesis that has gained some traction is that the dodecahedra were associated with Druidic practice. The Druids were the priestly and intellectual class of the Celtic peoples of northwestern Europe, including Britain and Gaul. Roman writers describe them with a mixture of fascination and horror as practitioners of human sacrifice and preservers of vast amounts of oral knowledge, including astronomical observation and natural philosophy. Julius Caesar famously wrote that the Druids could recite vast amounts of traditional learning from memory, having deliberately refused to commit it to writing to preserve the exclusivity of their knowledge. If the dodecahedra were Druidic instruments of some kind, that would explain their restriction to the northwestern provinces, where Celtic Druidic culture was strong. It would also explain the absence of any written reference to them in Roman sources. The Druids themselves would not have written about their tools, and Roman writers were unlikely to obtain detailed technical information about objects whose function was deliberately obscure. This remains speculation, but the dodecahedra are real. Approximately 100 of them have been found. They are carefully made from bronze, suggesting skilled craftsmanship and therefore some economic value. They were not discarded as waste. They were deposited deliberately, often in hoards or special deposits, and their function is still genuinely unknown. That is a remarkable situation for a civilization as well documented as Rome. After nearly 2,000 years of scholarship, we have found roughly 100 examples of a standardized form bronze object that appears across the northwestern provinces, and we still have no idea what it was for. Roman Britain also produced one of the most mysterious bathhouses ever excavated. At Bath, the Romans built an enormous complex of thermal baths around the hot spring of Sulis, a local deity whom they identified with their own goddess Minerva, creating a combined deity called Sulis Minerva. The baths were a major pilgrimage site, attracting visitors from across the Roman world. And within the sacred spring, archaeologists found over 12,000 objects thrown in as votive offerings: coins, jewelry, weapons, personal objects, and, most fascinatingly, curse tablets. The curse tablets of Bath are thin sheets of lead or tin on which petitioners inscribed their requests to Sulis Minerva, typically asking for divine intervention against thieves who had stolen from them. Over 130 curse tablets have been found in the spring at Bath, and they provide an extraordinary window into the everyday concerns of Roman-era Britons. Docilianus, son of Brucerus, to the most holy goddess, Sulis, I curse him who has stolen my hooded cloak, whether man or woman, whether slave or free, that the goddess Sulis inflict death upon him and not allow him sleep or children, now or in the future, until he has brought my hooded cloak to the temple of her divinity. This was written in Latin, in Britain, around the 2nd century AD, by or on behalf of a man who was very annoyed that someone had stolen his coat. It was then dropped into a sacred spring in the hope that a goddess would punish the thief. What makes this significant, beyond the obvious humanizing glimpse into everyday Roman-era life, is what it reveals about the way Roman and pre-Roman religious traditions interacted in Britain. Sulis was a British deity before the Romans arrived. The Romans recognized her, renamed the site after their own goddess, and created a syncretic cult that incorporated elements of both traditions. The worshippers who threw their curse tablets into the spring were participating in a religious practice that was neither purely Roman nor purely British, but a genuine fusion of the two, and that fusion is represented in the archaeology. The temple to Sulis Minerva incorporated design elements from both Roman religious architecture and local British traditions. The famous Gorgon's head pediment that crowned the temple entrance is technically a Roman sculptural convention, but the face depicted is male rather than female, the customary form of Medusa, and the surrounding decoration incorporates elements from British artistic traditions that predate the Roman occupation. The result is a piece of hybrid religious art that exists at the intersection of two cultures, made by craftsmen who had absorbed both traditions and produced something that belonged entirely to neither. It should not exist, in the sense that it defies simple categorization. It is British and Roman simultaneously, and more interesting for being both. Section 8. The Lost City Beneath the North Sea. There is a landscape that few living people have seen because it no longer exists. It was real. It was inhabited. It was, at its peak, one of the most ecologically rich areas in Europe, and it now lies beneath an average of 40 meters of the North Sea. Doggerland. During the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower than today, because so much of the world's water was locked in glaciers, the area between what is now Britain and the European mainland was dry land. Not a narrow land bridge, but a vast plain stretching from the eastern coast of England across to what is now Denmark and the Netherlands, encompassing an area larger than modern Britain itself. This land was inhabited. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived there, moving seasonally across the landscape, hunting the megafauna of the post-glacial environment, fishing the rivers, harvesting the rich coastal and estuarine resources of a landscape, where the sea met the land in a complex, productive ecology. As the climate warmed and the glaciers melted, sea levels rose. Slowly at first, then accelerating, the sea encroached on Doggerland from all sides. The people who lived there watched the water come. Over centuries, then over millennia, their territory shrank. Islands formed where hilltops had been. Valleys flooded and became sea inlets. The rivers that drained the plain were gradually drowned. Eventually, around 6000 BC, a catastrophic event accelerated the process enormously. A massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, called the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that struck the coastline of what was left of Doggerland, with waves estimated to have been several meters high, depending on local geography. This event, which may have swept away the last substantial areas of habitable Doggerland in a matter of hours, deposited a layer of tsunami sediment that has been identified in coastal Scotland and Scandinavia. After the tsunami, Doggerland was largely submerged. Britain became an island. For a long time, Doggerland was known primarily from fishing trawlers. Net hauls from the North Sea had, over decades of the 20th century, occasionally brought up not just fish, but bones. Mammoth bones, rhinoceros bones, bear skulls, and, crucially, worked artifacts. Stone tools, bone implements, a few carved objects that were clearly the work of human hands. Each of these finds demonstrated that Doggerland had been real, had been inhabited, and that its remains lay beneath the seabed. But systematic scientific investigation of Doggerland only became possible with the development of advanced seismic survey technology, originally deployed by the oil and gas industry to map the geology of the North Sea seafloor. When archaeologists gained access to this seismic data in the late 1990s and 2000s, the results were extraordinary. The surveys revealed an entire ancient landscape, preserved beneath the sediment of the North Sea. Hills and valleys, river channels, identifiable by their characteristic sinuous profiles, estuaries, lake basins, coastlines. This was not just evidence of land that had existed. It was the preserved topography of an inhabited landscape. Subsequent targeted excavations of North Sea sediment cores have yielded further treasures. A harpoon point carved from a mammoth's lurig bone, a piece of worked wood that dates to approximately 4000 BC, a decorated elk antler carved with patterns recovered by a British trawler in 1931 and now recognized as a ceremonial object from the submerged landscape. Perhaps most significantly, cores taken from what appears to be a former lake bed at the center of the ancient Doggerland Plain have produced pollen records and organic material that allow reconstruction of the ecology of the lost landscape. The picture that emerges is of a richly productive environment, extensive wetlands, marshes, rivers, surrounded by forest with abundant game, fish, and plant resources. This was not marginal territory. This was some of the most productive land in Mesolithic Europe. The people who lived there before the sea came in were not refugees clinging to a diminishing fringe. They were inhabitants of a rich and complex landscape, probably among the most prosperous communities in northern Europe. When the sea came, they lost everything. The descendants of Doggerland's people are presumably among the ancestors of modern British and Northern European populations. The genetic evidence suggests a complex story of population movement and replacement in Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe. But some genetic continuity with Mesolithic hunter-gatherers has been identified in modern British DNA. Some small fraction of the people reading this, or watching this, may carry genes from the last inhabitants of a landscape that has not been dry land for 6,000 years. What Doggerland means for our understanding of British prehistory is substantial. It means that Britain's Mesolithic past is literally inaccessible to us, hidden beneath 40 meters of water. The richest, most densely inhabited parts of the British Isles in the period 10,000 to 6,000 BC were not the highlands and uplands where Mesolithic sites have been found on land. They were the lowland plains, the river valleys, the coastal wetlands of Doggerland, all of which are now underwater. We have been reading British prehistory from the margins. The centre is gone. Section 9. Stonehenge. The things they don't tell you. Everyone knows Stonehenge. You have seen it in photographs, in school textbooks, on biscuit tins and tea towels. The image is so familiar that it has lost some of its capacity to astonish. So let us try to restore that capacity by setting aside the familiar and focusing on the things that are less commonly discussed. Stonehenge is not where it started. The site at Salisbury Plain was not chosen arbitrarily. Before the stones were erected, the landscape had already been shaped by human activity for centuries. Excavations have revealed a series of post holes from around 8,000 BC, 6,000 years before the stone monument was begun, which appear to represent tall wooden posts, possibly totemic structures. Whatever was happening at this site in the Mesolithic period, it was significant enough that people returned to it repeatedly. The earliest phase of the monument, as we typically define it, the earthwork enclosure with its bank and ditch, was built around 3000 BC. At this stage, there were no standing stones. There was a circular enclosure, roughly 100 meters in diameter, dug by antler picks into the chalk, and within it a series of pits that have been analysed extensively. These pits are called the Aubrey Holes, after the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey, who first identified them. There are 56 of them, equally spaced around the interior of the circular enclosure. When they were excavated, they were found to contain cremated human remains. The Aubrey Holes are a cremation cemetery. This has long been known. What has been more recently recognized is the significance of the number 56. 56 is a number that has a particular relationship with the lunar cycle. The moon's orbit is not perfectly regular. It wobbles, completing a cycle of wobble over approximately 18.6 years. Over 3 of those cycles, 56 years, the pattern of lunar events repeats closely enough that you can use a 56-position counting system to predict eclipses. If you move a marker, one position, around a ring of 56 posts each year, after 56 years, you are back where you started, and the pattern of lunar eclipses is predictable from the position of your marker. Some researchers have proposed that the Aubrey Holes served this function, that Stonehenge in its earliest phase was partly a lunar eclipse calculator, with markers moved around the ring to track the lunar cycle. This is controversial. The cremation deposits in the holes are real and clearly primary, but the holes might have served multiple functions. However, the fact that there are exactly 56 of them, when 56 is the significant number for long-term lunar prediction, is at minimum a striking coincidence. Then there is the question of who is buried at Stonehenge. Analysis of the cremated remains found in the Aubrey holes has produced some remarkable results. Isotope analysis of the bones can indicate where a person grew up based on the chemistry of the water they drank during childhood, which is incorporated into bone and tooth enamel. The bones from the Aubrey holes show a mixture of isotope signatures. Some of the people buried there grew up in the local area of Wiltshire, but others show isotope signatures consistent with Western Britain, including Wales and, in some cases, possibly Scotland or Ireland. People were being cremated and buried at Stonehenge from across the British Isles. This was a site of significance that drew people from hundreds of miles away, or that received the remains of people from hundreds of miles away, from the very beginning of its life as a monument. This reinforces the interpretation of Stonehenge as a place of special, religious or ritual significance in a landscape of sacred geography that extended across the whole of Britain. It was not a local monument. It was a pan-British monument, a place that meant something to communities from Cornwall to Caithness. The Sarsens deserve particular attention. The large upright stones of Stonehenge, the ones with the lintels across the top, forming the famous trilithons, are Sarsen sandstone. They come from the Marlborough Downs, approximately 25 miles to the north. Each one weighs between 20 and 30 metric tons. The tallest is just under 7 meters high. Moving these stones required a logistical operation of extraordinary scale. Sledges, ropes, timber rollers, organized labor teams, surveyed routes. Experimental archaeology has estimated that moving a single sarsen from the Marlborough Downs to Salisbury Plain required approximately 1,000 people working with ropes and sledges. To move the 30 sarsens of the outer circle, plus the 5 trilithons of the inner horseshoe, approximately 100 stones in total counting uprights and lintels, over a period of several years, would have required the sustained mobilization of thousands of people. This means Stonehenge was not built by the local community. It was built by a project that drew labor and resources from across a substantial region. It was, in modern terms, a national project, requiring national-level organization and coordination. But the most recent significant Stonehenge discovery is something that has received remarkably little coverage outside specialist circles. In 2018, analysis of the sarsen stones themselves using portable X-ray fluorescence technology revealed that the stones are not all the same type of sarsen. Silcrete, which is what sarsen essentially is, varies in its chemical composition depending on where it forms. When the Stonehenge sarsens were analyzed, 29 of the 30 upright sarsens showed the same chemical signature, consistent with a single source area on the Marlborough Downs, specifically near a place called West Woods. But the 30th upright, stone 58, and the altar stone at the centre of the monument are chemically different. Stone 58's composition does not match any known sarsen source in Wiltshire, and the altar stone, which lies flat at the centre of the monument, is not sarsen at all. It is a type of sandstone called altar stone that comes from, geochemical analysis suggests, somewhere in Wales or the Welsh Marches. Why is there a stone at the very centre of Stonehenge that comes from Wales? Is this connected to the bluestone transport? Is it an older feature, a foundation stone from an earlier monument? Is it, like the bluestones themselves, a stone that was moved because the specific stone from the specific place mattered? Not just any stone. We do not know. But the altar stone, lying flat at the centre of Stonehenge, its origin still uncertain, its purpose still debated, is in many ways the perfect symbol of the whole monument. At the centre of the most famous prehistoric monument in the world, there is still a mystery. Section 10. Avebury and the landscape that thinks. If Stonehenge is famous, Avebury is misunderstood. Most visitors who make the short drive from Stonehenge to Avebury arrive expecting something smaller and are surprised. Avebury is not smaller than Stonehenge. Avebury is Stonehenge scaled up by an order of magnitude. The Avebury complex consists of the largest stone circle in the world, a henge enclosure approximately 400 meters in diameter, containing multiple internal stone settings, connected by two stone avenues, each roughly 2 kilometers long, associated with further monuments, including Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric mound in Europe, and the West Kennet Long Barrow, one of the largest Neolithic collective tombs in Britain. The whole complex was built and modified over roughly 800 years, from approximately 3000 to 2200 BC. And the village of Avebury sits inside it. There are houses, a pub, a car park, inside the stone circle. Medieval villagers, who had no idea what the stones were and found them practically inconvenient, built their community among them. Some stones were toppled and used as building material. Some were buried. Some were broken up with fire and water, a process that involved heating the stone and then cooling it rapidly to cause fracture, a technique known from Avebury and from other megalithic sites. A famous archaeological find was the skeleton of a man found buried beneath a toppled stone, apparently killed when it fell on him during a medieval demolition attempt. The scale of what was originally here, before medieval and post-medieval destruction, was extraordinary. The outer circle contained approximately 100 standing stones, many of them enormous, weighing over 40 metric tons each. The two avenues, Beckhampton to the west and Kennet to the east, were each flanked by stones spaced at regular intervals. The inner circles, of which there were two within the main enclosure, each had their own internal features. Moving through the Avebury complex, even in its damaged modern state, is an experience unlike any other prehistoric monument in Britain. You are walking inside a living ceremonial landscape that has been made by human hands on a scale that strains comprehension. The bank and ditch of the henge enclosure, largely intact, are themselves monumental. The ditch is approximately 9 meters deep and 20 meters wide, cut into solid chalk by people using antler picks, baskets, and their hands. The amount of chalk that had to be quarried and moved to create this enclosure has been estimated at tens of thousands of tons. Why? Why here? Why this scale? The landscape context may offer a partial answer. Avebury sits at the center of a cluster of prehistoric monuments of various types and dates that make the chalk downland around it one of the densest concentrations of Neolithic and Bronze Age archaeology anywhere in Europe. Silbury Hill, which rises 60 meters from the plain and contains as much chalk as half of Avebury's henge, was probably built in stages between approximately 2400 and 2200 BC. Its interior, which has been tunneled and analyzed multiple times since the 18th century, has yielded no burial, no treasure, no artifact that clearly explains its purpose. It is the largest monument to an unknown intention in the British Isles. West Kennet Long Barrow, a few hundred meters from Silbury Hill, is a different kind of monument entirely. A Neolithic communal tomb, roughly 100 meters long, in which the remains of dozens of individuals were deposited over perhaps 1,000 years. The bones were not left undisturbed. They were rearranged, sorted, moved, with skulls and long bones separated and grouped. This is not accidental. The manipulation of the bones was deliberate, part of a practice of ancestor veneration that used the physical remains of the dead as active participants in ritual. The Windmill Hill causewayed enclosure, north of Avebury, dates even earlier to around 30-700 BC. It is an enclosure of a type found across Neolithic Britain and Europe, where the surrounding bank and ditch are interrupted by many causeways, creating a structure that is enclosed but permeable, bounded but accessible from many directions. Causewayed enclosures are now thought to have functioned as places of seasonal gathering for scattered communities, places where people came together to feast, trade, negotiate marriages and alliances, exchange cattle, and perhaps to perform the communal rituals that reinforced social bonds across dispersed communities. The Avebury landscape, then, is not a collection of separate monuments. It is a single ceremonial landscape that was created, maintained, and added to over roughly 2,000 years. Each element, the tomb, the causewayed enclosure, the stone circles, the avenues, the enormous mound of Silbury, was part of a cumulative sacred geography that grew more complex with each generation. This is something we rarely do anymore. We build monuments for single purposes, for a single generation. We do not expect our descendants to add to them, elaborate them, layer them with new meaning. But the people of prehistoric Britain understood their sacred landscape as something alive, something that grew and changed with them. They were not preserving a fixed tradition. They were participating in an ongoing conversation with the landscape and with the dead. That is, a different relationship with the past than the one we typically maintain. And looking at Avebury, at the sheer accumulated scale of what generations of people built here over 2 millennia, it is hard not to feel that something important was happening in that relationship that we have lost. Section 11. The Water of the Gods. Sacred deposits in British rivers and lakes. One of the strangest recurring patterns in British prehistoric and early historic archaeology is the deliberate deposition of valuable objects in water. It is not occasional, it is systematic. From the Neolithic period through the Iron Age and into the early medieval period, across Britain and Ireland, people were regularly, deliberately, and in large quantities throwing valuable objects into rivers, lakes, bogs, and wetlands. Bronze weapons, gold jewellery, decorated cauldrons, Roman coins, Viking silver, fine metalwork of every kind. The Thames alone has yielded hundreds of Bronze Age and Iron Age weapons, shields, helmets, and personal ornaments. Many of them are among the finest pieces of metalwork from their respective periods. The Waterloo helmet, a horned ceremonial helmet of extraordinary craftsmanship, found in the Thames near Waterloo Bridge in 1868, is one of only 2 Iron Age helmets ever found in Britain, and it was in the river. The Battersea shield, polished bronze inlaid with red glass, is another Thames find, a masterpiece of Celtic craftsmanship that was never used in battle. Its polish shows no evidence of combat damage. It was made, it seems, to be thrown in the water. This is the pattern that demands explanation. These were not accidental losses. Objects do not accidentally fall into rivers in the quantities and qualities that the Thames and other British waterways have produced. Swords are not accidentally dropped into rivers. Shields are not accidentally lost in bogs. These were deliberate deposits of valuable, often ceremonially significant objects. The interpretation that has gained the broadest acceptance is that these were offerings, gifts to powers associated with water. Rivers in particular were widely understood in ancient European cultures as liminal places, boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead or the supernatural. To give something to a river was to give it to whatever power the river represented. But there is more going on at some of these sites than simple votive deposition. Flag Fen in Cambridgeshire is a site that takes water deposition to an extraordinary level. Preserved beneath the Fenland peat, archaeologists discovered a massive Bronze Age timber platform built out into an ancient lake. Connected to the shore by a wooden causeway, approximately a kilometre long, the causeway and platform date to approximately 1300 to 900 BC. And around the causeway, in the water on either side, were thousands of objects: swords, spears, personal ornaments, pottery, and fragments of everything imaginable. This was not random littering. The pattern of deposition shows that objects were placed in specific ways, some whole, some deliberately broken, some carefully arranged. Analysis of the animal bones from the site suggests that animals were slaughtered and their remains thrown into the water as part of the ritual. Flag Fen seems to have functioned as a permanent site of offering over a period of roughly 4 centuries. People came here repeatedly, regularly, over many generations to deposit valuable things in the water beside a wooden platform in a lake. The scale of the deposition, the consistency of the practice, and the architectural investment in the causeway and platform all point to an institutionalized ritual site, a place where the practice of giving to the water was organized and maintained. The most dramatic single example of deliberate water deposition in Britain is not Bronze Age, but Iron Age. The discovery at Llyn Cerrig Bach on Anglesey in Wales. In 1943, during construction of an airfield, workers found a deposit of Iron Age metalwork in what had been a lake. The deposit was extraordinary. 174 objects, including swords, spears, shield fragments, horse harness, wagon fittings, iron gang chains used to bind slaves, and a decorated bronze plaque. The objects span a period of approximately 300 BC to AD 60, suggesting that the site was used as a votive deposit for almost 4 centuries. The slave chains from Llyn Cerrig Bach are particularly disturbing. These are actual iron chains designed to link multiple individuals at the neck, clearly used to constrain enslaved people. To throw them in a lake was presumably to consecrate them, or perhaps to retire them after use, or possibly, though this is more speculative, to mark the release of the enslaved people they had bound. We do not know. What we know is that Llyn Cerrig Bach was an important religious site for Iron Age Anglesey, possibly associated with the Druids for whom the island was a major centre. Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes the Roman attack on Anglesey in AD 60 as targeting specifically the Druids and their sacred groves. Whether Llyn Cerrig Bach was associated with Druidic practice cannot be confirmed, but the timing, the location, and the character of the deposits are suggestive. The tradition of depositing things in water is one that did not end with the Iron Age. It continues through the Roman period, through the early medieval period, and in attenuated form all the way to the present. Throwing a coin in a wishing well or fountain is the direct cultural descendant of Bronze Age votive deposition. The impulse to give something to the water, to engage in an exchange with whatever power the water represents, is 4,000 years old in Britain and has never entirely gone away. That persistence is itself remarkable. Ideas die hard. Practices that are embedded in how people relate to the landscape, that are tied to places themselves rather than to abstract doctrines, can survive the replacement of one formal religious system by another. The water still receives gifts. The impulse is still there. The cosmology that originally animated it has changed beyond recognition, but the practice persists. Section 12. The Iron Age. Britons and the heads they kept. There is something disturbing in the archaeology of Iron Age Britain that tends to get smoothed over in popular accounts. The people who lived in these islands in the centuries before and immediately after the Roman conquest had a relationship with the human head that was, from any modern perspective, deeply strange. The cult of the head in Celtic Britain and Gaul is documented in classical sources. Greek and Roman writers describe the Celts cutting off the heads of enemies killed in battle, preserving them, displaying them, and treating them as objects of power. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, says the Gauls preserved the heads of notable enemies in cedar oil, keeping them as treasures and showing them to guests. Diodorus Siculus writes that they nailed the heads of enemies to their houses. Archaeological evidence from Britain confirms and complicates this picture. At Stanwick in North Yorkshire, the large Iron Age enclosure that may have been the site of a tribal capital of the Brigantes, archaeologists found human skulls that had been specially treated. The skulls showed cut marks suggesting careful defleshing after death, and some had been polished or treated in ways that indicate deliberate preservation. These were not accidental deposits. They were curated objects. At Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire, one of the most extensively excavated Iron Age settlements in Britain, the bones found in storage pits include a disproportionate number of skull fragments. The pits themselves appear to have had ritual significance, with their contents deposited in ways that suggest symbolic as well as practical function. Grain storage pits that had gone out of use were often filled with structured deposits, including animal and human remains, in patterns that seem intended rather than casual. The ritual deposits at Danebury, studied in detail by archaeologist Barry Cunliffe over decades of excavation, suggest a community that maintained a constant relationship between the practical and the sacred. The storage of grain was not a purely economic act. It took place in pits that were also sites of offering, that were connected to the agricultural cycle in ways that had both practical and ritual dimensions. The line between technology and religion, between management and worship, was not drawn where we would draw it today. But it is the severed heads that attract the most archaeological attention, and for good reason. In 2003, at a site in Hertfordshire, excavations ahead of a housing development revealed an Iron Age and early Roman period site containing, in a series of specially constructed pits, the skulls of at least 17 individuals. The skulls had been carefully selected. The remains of the post-cranial skeleton were largely absent, suggesting the skulls had been brought to the site separately, and they had been deposited in ways that indicate deliberate arrangement. Some were accompanied by iron objects. Some were placed face down. Some were oriented towards specific cardinal directions. This was not waste disposal. This was a skull deposit, a collection of human heads maintained in pits, over what appears to have been a period of decades or centuries. Similar deposits have been found at other sites. At Gasage All Saints in Dorset, at South Cadbury in Somerset, and at numerous cave sites in the Mendip Hills, skull deposits with characteristics suggesting deliberate collection and curation have been identified. The classical sources tell us that the heads of enemies were kept as trophies and as objects of power. But the British archaeological evidence is more complex than trophy keeping. The care taken in the deposition of the skulls, the selection and arrangement, the accompanying objects, all suggest that these were not simply trophies. They were objects maintained in a specific relationship with the community, perhaps as interfaces with the ancestral or supernatural world, perhaps as guardians of the settlements where they were kept. Celtic mythology in Ireland and Wales, which preserves some traditions that may echo Iron Age beliefs, includes many stories of severed heads that remain conscious and articulate. The Welsh tale of Bran the Blessed ends with his severed head remaining alive for 80 years, continuing to speak and feast with its companions. The Norse stories of talking heads, most famously the head of Mimir, that Odin preserves and consults for wisdom, reflect a similar belief in the head as a locus of personhood and wisdom that persists after death. If some version of this belief system was operating in Iron Age Britain, the skull deposits make a different kind of sense. These were not just trophies. They were kept, curated, deposited in special contexts, because they were understood as still possessing agency. The heads of the dead, of particular dead people, were maintained in relationship with the living community because they were useful, as advisors, as protectors, as links to whatever powers the community needed access to. This is a worldview in which the dead do not simply cease to exist. They continue, in diminished or transformed form, to participate in the affairs of the living, and the material remains of the dead, particularly the head, which was understood as the primary seat of personhood, were the physical interfaces through which that continued participation was managed. We find this disturbing. We are meant to find it disturbing. But understanding it, even without approving of it, is important for understanding the people who built the hill forts and crafted the beautiful metalwork and organized the sophisticated societies of Iron Age Britain. They were not barbarians in the popular sense. They were people with a sophisticated, if to us alien, understanding of life, death, and the obligations between the living and the dead. Section 13. The Roman Withdrawal and the Mysteries. It left in at 410. The Emperor Honorius famously told the cities of Britain to look to their own defense. The Roman legions had been withdrawing from Britain for years, recalled to deal with crises closer to the heart of the empire. By the early 5th century, Britain was effectively on its own. What happened next is one of the most contested and interesting questions in British history. The post-Roman period, roughly AD 400 to 600, is often called the Dark Ages in Britain, not because it was particularly benighted, but because the documentary sources thin dramatically. The Roman administrative machine that had produced vast quantities of written records ceased to function. The cities that had been administrative centres began to change in ways we are still trying to understand. And archaeology keeps finding things that complicate the picture. The traditional model of post-Roman Britain involved a rapid collapse. Roman civilization vanishing, urban centres being abandoned, the economy contracting sharply, and a population of Romanized Britons being gradually overwhelmed or replaced by incoming Anglo-Saxon migrants from the continent. This model drew on a combination of the limited documentary sources, which are heavily biased toward Anglo-Saxon England in the later period, and a certain cultural assumption that civilization, specifically Roman civilization, was what maintained order, prosperity, and sophistication. Archaeological evidence has been systematically undermining this model for decades. Urban centres did not simply collapse after the Romans left. At several sites, including Winchester, Lincoln, and Roxton in Shropshire, there is evidence of continued activity in the 5th and into the 6th century. At Roxton, which was the 4th largest city in Roman Britain, archaeologist Philip Barker spent decades excavating the post-Roman levels and found evidence of a substantial, organized community continuing to use the space long after the end of Roman administration. The buildings were changed, the style of construction shifted away from Roman masonry and back toward timber, but they were not abandoned. More recently, excavations at the site of the Roman town of Viraconium, also at Roxeter, have revealed a remarkable post-Roman sequence. In the 5th and early 6th century, someone with significant resources and organizational capacity was constructing a large timber hall on the foundations of the Roman basilica. This is not squatting in ruins. This is deliberate resourced construction, suggesting a community with authority, wealth, and a vision of how to use the existing urban space. Who was this? There is a tantalizing possibility. Roxeter is in the region of Britain that some researchers have associated with a real historical figure behind the legend of Arthur. The timing, the location, the evidence of organized power in the post-Roman period all align with what little we know of the historical context from which the Arthurian legend may have grown. This is speculation. But the Roxeter evidence is real. Someone was building in the ruins of Roman Britain with the resources and authority of a substantial regional power. Whether or not that someone had any connection to any proto-historical Arthur is unknowable. But the fact that the evidence points to continued organization, continued urban life, continued economic complexity in post-Roman Britain is increasingly well established. The hoard evidence from the post-Roman period also complicates the collapse narrative. The Hoxton hoard, found in Suffolk in 1992 with a metal detector, is the largest hoard of late Roman gold and silver found in Britain. It contained over 15,000 gold, silver, and bronze coins, as well as gold jewelry and silver tableware of extraordinary quality, all deposited in a wooden box around the end of the 4th or early 5th century. The quality of the objects, the sheer quantity of wealth, and the care with which the box was deposited all suggest a wealthy household with considerable resources, not a community in the process of collapsing. The silver pepper pots of the Hoxton hoard deserve particular mention. There are 4 of them, exquisite pieces of late Roman silversmithing, including a bust portrait of a woman of evident status and a figure of a crouching tigress. These are luxury objects of the highest order, reflecting a household connected to the cultural and economic networks of the late Roman world at a level we rarely imagine for Britain. The Mildenhall treasure, found in Suffolk in 1942, is another extraordinary late Roman hoard from eastern England, a collection of silver tableware of exceptional quality, including a dish over 60 centimeters in diameter, decorated with scenes from the mythology of Oceanus and Bacchus that represents the absolute pinnacle of late Roman metalwork. The great dish from Mildenhall is one of the finest pieces of Roman silver ever found anywhere in the empire. This is not the archaeology of a provincial backwater. This is the archaeology of a wealthy, sophisticated, culturally connected region of the late Roman world. And when the Roman administration withdrew, the people who owned this kind of wealth did not immediately vanish. They adapted, negotiated, reorganized, and some of them, as the Wroxeter evidence suggests, continued to exercise significant power for a century or more after the official end of Roman Britain. Section 14. The Sutton Hoo Ship and the Kingdom, hidden in Suffolk. In 1938, a widow named Edith Pretty, who owned the Sutton Hoo estate in Suffolk, asked a local archaeologist, Basil Brown, to excavate the burial mounds on her property. Basil Brown was not a university academic. He was a self-taught archaeologist of the amateur tradition, skilled, careful, and experienced. The academic establishment did not take the excavation particularly seriously at first. They changed their minds. The mound that Brown opened in 1939, Mound 1, contained no stone chamber, no Roman brickwork, no familiar prehistoric structure. It contained the impression of a ship. An Anglo-Saxon ship, approximately 27 meters long, had been dragged up from the River Deben, placed in a prepared trench on the hillside, and buried. The wood had long since decayed, but the iron rivets that had held the planks together remained, along with the ghost of the original timber in the soil chemistry, and together they allowed the complete form of the ship to be recovered. Inside the ship was a burial chamber, a small structure within the hull of the vessel, and inside the chamber was one of the greatest treasure deposits ever found in Britain. The Sutton Hoo treasure is so extraordinary that listing its components runs the risk of numbing the reader with luxury. The helmet, now perhaps the most iconic object in early medieval British archaeology, is a full iron face mask helmet decorated with intricate panelled scenes of warriors and monsters in a style that connects to Scandinavian traditions. The gold belt buckle weighs over 400 grams and is decorated with interlacing animal patterns of extraordinary intricacy. The shoulder clasps are inlaid with garnet and cloisonné technique. Thousands of individually cut pieces of red stone, set in gold cells to create designs of precise complexity that required specialized knowledge and tools to execute. There are Byzantine silver bowls, imported from the eastern Mediterranean. There is a large silver dish bearing the control stamps of the Emperor Anastasius, who ruled from Constantinople from 491 to 518 AD, making it a diplomatic or trade object of the highest status. There are spoons inscribed in Greek with the names Saul and Paul, possibly baptismal gifts. There are Frankish coins, Swedish weapons, and Coptic bronze bowls from North Africa. Sutton Hoo is the burial of a man at the center of an international network. Whoever was interred here was connected by trade, diplomacy, alliance, or all three, to the Byzantine Empire, to Frankish Gaul, to Scandinavia, and to the Christian Church. He was simultaneously embedded in the pagan Anglo-Saxon world, the warrior culture of the mead hall and the ship burial, and in the wider political and cultural economy of post-Roman Europe. The question of who was buried at Sutton Hoo has never been definitively answered. No body was found, though this may reflect soil chemistry rather than an absence of burial. The leading candidate, based on historical records and the dating of the coins and objects in the burial, is Raedwald of East Anglia, who died around 625 AD and who was, in Bede's account, the most powerful king in Britain during his reign. Raedwald is a fascinating figure for reasons beyond the burial. Bede tells us that he was baptized as a Christian, apparently sincerely, but then hedged his bets by maintaining altars to the old gods alongside his Christian altar. He was, in the terms of the period, simultaneously a baptized Christian king and a practitioner of the traditional Anglo-Saxon religion. If Raedwald is the man in Mound 1, then his burial, a pagan ship burial with no Christian iconography, was either the choice of survivors who were not Christian or a deliberate decision to bury him in the old way, despite his nominal Christianity, or some more complex negotiation of identity and tradition that we cannot fully reconstruct. The Byzantine silver, the spoons with Christian names, coexist in the burial with the pagan iconography of the helmet and the symbolism of the ship voyage to the afterlife. Sutton Hoo is a monument to complexity. It resists simple categorization into pagan or Christian, Scandinavian or British, warrior or diplomat. It is all of these things at once, because the man it was built for was all of these things at once. And that complexity, that refusal to fit cleanly into a single category, is a window into the real texture of early medieval Britain, in ways that the simple narratives of pagan versus Christian or barbarian versus Roman cannot capture. Basil Brown, the self-taught archaeologist who opened the mound and recognized immediately that something extraordinary was present, handled the initial excavation with great skill. He was replaced by the academic establishment once the significance of the find became apparent, and it took many years for his contribution to receive the recognition it deserved. A recent film, The Dig, dramatized the events of the 1939 excavation and brought the story of Sutton Hoo to a new generation of audiences. But the film necessarily simplified a situation that was, in reality, complicated by class, by professional jealousy, and by the peculiar social dynamics of British archaeology in the interwar period. Brown's great achievement was not just finding the treasure, it was recognizing the significance of the rivets, the ghost of the ship, and understanding how to excavate it in a way that preserved the maximum information. 30 years of experience in the Suffolk soil paid off in those weeks in 1939. The treasure was remarkable. But the ship, the context, the archaeology, that was his. Section 15. The Pictish Problem. Symbols without a key. In the years following the Roman withdrawal from Scotland, a people emerged into history who have fascinated and baffled scholars ever since. The Picts, who occupied most of what is now Scotland north of the Fourth Clyde Line, were a confederation of tribal groups who left behind some of the most extraordinary and mysterious art in the British Isles, and about whom we know far less than we should. The Picts appear in Roman sources from the late 3rd century AD onward, usually as raiders and fighters. After Rome left, they dominated northern Britain for centuries, producing complex metalwork, elaborate stone sculptures, and a symbol system that appears on hundreds of carved stones across Scotland. They eventually merged with the incoming Gaelic Scots under Kenneth MacAlpin around 843 AD, and within a few generations the Pictish language, the Pictish identity, and the Pictish symbol system had all disappeared. What they left behind is the symbol stones. Pictish symbol stones are carved sandstone or granite slabs, some of them standing stones, some of them recumbent, found across northeastern and central Scotland. There are approximately 200 of them. They carry a repertoire of symbols that recur consistently across a huge geographical range. The mirror and comb, the double disc and Z-rod, the crescent and V-rod, the rectangle with spiral terminals. Various animal figures, including the Pictish beast, whose species cannot be identified, the eagle, the salmon, and others. The symbols appear alone, in combination, and sometimes alongside Christian imagery that was added later after the Picts began converting to Christianity. The symbols clearly form a communication system. They are too consistent, too geographically widespread, and too carefully reproduced to be random decorative motifs. They mean something. The combinations in which they appear, the regular pairing of certain symbols, the consistent way they are arranged on the stones, all suggest a grammar, a set of rules governing how the symbols are combined to produce specific meanings. But what those meanings are remains, after centuries of scholarly effort, essentially unknown. We have no Pictish Rosetta Stone. We have no bilingual inscription that gives us the key. The Picts were literate in the sense of using Ogham, an early medieval Irish alphabet-based script, and a handful of Pictish Ogham inscriptions survive. But the Ogham texts record personal names and genealogies in a language, Pictish, that is so poorly attested that even these limited texts cannot be fully translated. We do not know enough Pictish to decode the inscriptions, and we cannot use the inscriptions to learn enough Pictish to decode them. This is a circular problem of the most frustrating kind. Many hypotheses have been advanced for the meaning of the symbols. The most widely held among archaeologists is that the symbols on the stones are genealogical or commemorative, that they record, in a conventionalized, symbolic shorthand, the names, lineages, or accomplishments of individuals, perhaps functioning as grave markers or territorial declarations. The consistent pairing of certain symbols might represent names composed of two elements, a common pattern in many naming systems. If this is correct, then the symbol stones are the equivalent of a vast corpus of personal and genealogical inscriptions in a language we cannot read. They represent the names and identities of hundreds of individuals from Pictish Scotland, permanently carved in stone, permanently inaccessible to us because we have lost the key. There is something poignant about that. The Picts went to considerable effort to create these stones. The carving is often of high quality, the designs are precise and consistent, and the stones were clearly important enough to be commissioned and displayed. Whatever they communicated, it mattered enough to put in stone, and we have completely lost the ability to receive the communication. Some researchers have taken a different approach and suggested that the symbols are not linguistic in the strict sense, but mnemonic or heraldic, that they serve as visual identifiers for clans or social groups rather than as a writing system proper. On this interpretation, the consistent combinations of symbols represent specific alliances, royal genealogies, or territorial claims, visible and identifiable to anyone within the system, but not readable in the way an inscription is readable. This interpretation draws some support from the way the symbols are used with Christian imagery as the Picts converted. The symbol stones with crosses added to them seem to indicate that the symbol system was capable of coexisting with Christian commemorative practice, suggesting a function more like heraldry than like pagan religious iconography that would need to be abandoned or replaced. But whatever the symbols meant, the animals of the Pictish repertoire demand separate attention. The eagle, the salmon, the horse, the bull, and the boar are all recognizable. But the so-called Pictish beast is in a category of its own. It appears frequently, it is one of the most common symbols in the repertoire, but the animal it represents cannot be identified with any real species. It has a long nose or beak that curves backward, forelegs that terminate in scrolls, a body that combines features of multiple animals, and a tail that spirals. Some researchers have suggested it represents a dolphin in a highly stylized form, perhaps derived from Roman art of sea creatures. Others have suggested it is a mythological beast, a creature from Pictish cosmology for which we have no other record. The Pictish beast, unidentifiable, Widespread, clearly important, is the perfect emblem of the Pictish problem as a whole. It was significant. It communicated something that mattered, and we cannot tell you what it was. Section 16. The Cerne Abbas Giant and the Question of Ancient Erotica. On a chalk hillside in Dorset, cut into the turf to expose the white chalk below, there is a giant figure of a man. He is approximately 55 meters tall, holding a knobbled club in his right hand, and he is emphatically, unmistakably, anatomically explicit. The Cerne Abbas giant has been the subject of considerable discussion over the centuries, not all of it scholarly. The figure is a chalk hill figure, one of several surviving in Britain. The most famous others are the White Horse of Uffington in Oxfordshire and the Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex. Chalk hill figures are made by cutting through the turf to expose the chalk below, creating a white design visible from a considerable distance. They require regular maintenance. The turf that is cleared grows back if not periodically cut away, and without attention, a chalk figure will gradually disappear under vegetation. This maintenance requirement has consequences for the question of how old the surviving figures are. Only figures that have been continuously maintained since their creation are still visible. Figures that fell out of use, whose communities no longer maintained them, are simply gone, returfed, invisible. The figures we see are therefore only those that have been in continuous local use, which in a sense makes them not pure archaeological survivals, but living cultural objects still tied to their communities. And the Cerne Abbas giant has undoubtedly been in local use. Folklore from Dorset records that women who wanted to conceive would sleep on the figure. Couples who wanted fertility would have intercourse on the giant himself, specifically within the outline of his imposing attribute. The site has been associated with fertility magic and ritual for as long as local records go back. But how old is it? This question was not answered until 2021, when a team from the National Trust and the University of Gloucestershire conducted optically stimulated luminescence dating of soil from the deepest point of the original figure cutting. This technique measures when soil was last exposed to sunlight, allowing dating of when the figure was cut. The results suggested the giant was created between 700 and 1100 AD, most likely in the early medieval period, rather than in prehistoric antiquity. This was a revision of the previously common assumption that the giant was ancient, perhaps Iron Age or Roman. The dating evidence points to the early medieval period, which puts it in a different cultural context than the prehistoric monuments we have been discussing. But this does not make it less interesting. An early medieval date places the Cerne Abbas giant in the context of a Christianity-dominated Britain in which the church was actively suppressing the older religious traditions. To cut a large, explicitly phallic figure into a hillside during this period was a cultural act of some significance. It was either tolerated by the church, which would be surprising, or maintained in defiance of church authority, or perhaps created in a period of instability when church control was weaker. Some researchers have connected the giant to Hercules, whose cult was widespread in the Roman period and who is typically depicted with a club and who was associated with strength and fertility. If the figure was created in the post-Roman period, before Christianity had fully consolidated its hold, it might represent a survival of Roman religious traditions being maintained or revived by a local community. Others have connected the figure to the Anglo-Saxon culture of the period, specifically to the figure of the god Helith mentioned in a monastic chronicle as associated with Cairn Abbey, the medieval monastery built at the foot of the hill. Helith may be a garbled reference to Hercules, or he may be a separate figure from the Germanic pantheon, or he may be a purely local deity. We do not know. What we do know is that the Cerne Abbas giant has persisted. Through the medieval period, through the Reformation, through the centuries of varying religious and cultural climates that have followed, The figure has been maintained on that Dorset hillside. People have kept cutting away the turf, kept revealing the chalk, kept the giant visible. Whatever he meant when he was first cut, he has continued to mean something to the communities who maintained him. The White Horse of Uffington, by contrast, is genuinely ancient. Detailed analysis of the figure and its context, combined with optically stimulated luminescence dating, suggests it was created around 1000 BC in the Late Bronze Age. It is the oldest chalk hill figure currently known in Britain and one of the oldest land artworks in the world. The Uffington horse is a remarkable piece of design. Unlike the more naturalistically drawn horses of medieval and later periods, the Uffington horse is highly stylized, its body reduced to a few dramatic sweeping lines that convey the essence of horse movement without attempting realistic representation. Art historians have compared it to the horse figures on contemporary Bronze Age metalwork, and the stylistic connection is clear. This was a tradition of representing the horse in a specific, conventionalized way that was consistent across different media, from decorated bronze to chalk hillside. The horse is 360 feet long. It is visible from many miles away in good conditions. It sits beneath the earthwork of Uffington Castle, an Iron Age hill fort, though the horse predates the hill fort by many centuries. The relationship between the horse and the hill fort, whether the later builders of the fort knew the horse was there, whether they respected or modified it, is unclear. Below the horse, on the valley floor, is a flat-topped mound called Dragon Hill, where, local tradition holds, St. George killed the dragon. The chalk on the top of the mound is bare, supposedly because the dragon's blood, where it fell, has prevented any vegetation from growing. This is obviously folklore, but the geographical relationship between the ancient horse figure and the more recent dragon-slaying tradition suggests a long history of significant events being attributed to this particular landscape, generation after generation, reading meaning into the same place. Section 17. The Vikings in Britain. What they actually left behind. The popular image of the Vikings is of raiders, rapists, and destroyers, longships and battle axes. This image is not entirely wrong. The Viking raids on Britain, beginning with the famous attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 AD, were genuinely violent and destructive events. The Norse raiders targeted monasteries and coastal settlements with deliberate ferocity. But the archaeology of Viking Britain is far more complex than raiding. From the late 9th century onward, Scandinavian settlers established communities across large parts of northern and eastern England in the area that came to be known as the Danelaw, where Norse law and custom held sway. They settled in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, and across a huge swathe of the Midlands and North. They named places, a legacy preserved in the modern map, names ending in by farm or village in Old Norse, thorp, secondary settlement, thwaite, clearing, toft, homestead, are Viking in origin and are concentrated exactly in the areas of heaviest Scandinavian settlement. But the material evidence for Viking settlement, the actual physical objects and structures left by Norse settlers in Britain, is surprisingly sparse given the documentary and place name evidence for their presence. This is partly because Norse settlers in Britain quickly adapted their material culture to local conditions, making it difficult to identify them archaeologically when their objects look increasingly similar to Anglo-Saxon equivalents. What survives is precious. The Vale of York hoard, found by two amateur metal detectorists in 2007 in a field in North Yorkshire, is the largest hoard of Viking-age silver found in Britain. It contains 617 coins and 65 other objects, including a silver-gilt cup of Frankish manufacture, silver ingots, armbands, and jewellery from many different cultures: Anglo-Saxon, Carolingian, Scandinavian, Byzantine, Islamic. The hoard was buried around 928 AD when the Viking kingdom of Jorvik was under threat from the expanding power of the Anglo-Saxon kings of Wessex. The cup that contained the hoard is itself a remarkable object. It is Carolingian, made in the Frankish kingdom of the 9th century, decorated with animals in a style influenced by Eastern Christian art, and it ended up in Viking York before being buried in a field in North Yorkshire, where it stayed until 2007. Each step in its journey tells a story about the movement of luxury goods through the networks of early medieval Europe. The Islamic coins in the hoard are perhaps the most striking indicator of the breadth of Viking connections. The Norse trading network, by the 9th and 10th centuries, extended from Newfoundland in the west to the markets of Baghdad in the east. Norse traders, traveling via the rivers of Eastern Europe, brought furs, slaves, and amber to the Islamic world and returned with silver dirhams, which they valued primarily for their silver content rather than their face value as coins. Those Islamic dirhams, minted in distant caliphates and carried across half the known world by Norse traders, ended up in a silver hoard in Yorkshire. The global connections of what we tend to think of as a local provincial period of British history are astonishing. The York Minster excavations, conducted beneath the medieval cathedral in the 1960s and 1970s, revealed the physical structure of the Viking city of Jorvik in remarkable detail. The waterlogged conditions of the Coppergate area, excavated in a major project in the late 1970s and early 1980s, produced organic material of extraordinary quality. Leather shoes, wooden objects, textile fragments, food remains, and most famously, the oldest known knitted sock in Britain. The Viking inhabitants of York were making and wearing knitted socks. This is not what the helmet and axe image of the Vikings prepares you for. The Coppergate excavations also produced evidence of specialized craft production. Metalworking, amber working, jet carving, antler working. Jorvik was an industrial city, as well as a trading centre, with workshops producing luxury goods for local consumption and for export. The amber came from the Baltic. The jet came from Whitby, a few miles up the Yorkshire coast. The finished objects were sold locally or traded onward through the same networks that brought Islamic silver to Yorkshire. One find from the Coppergate excavations became unexpectedly famous. The Lloyd's Bank coprolite, a 9-inch sample of fossilized human feces, estimated to date to the Viking period, which was analyzed to reveal the diet of its original owner. The results showed a diet of meat and grain with a substantial parasite load, specifically whipworm and moorworm eggs, which were present in such quantities as to suggest a significant and uncomfortable intestinal infestation. The owner of the Lloyd's Bank coprolite was miserable. Their gut was full of parasites. They ate mostly meat and grain. They had no idea they were leaving behind an archaeological record, and they are now permanently memorialized in the museum at Jorvik, where their most intimate deposit is displayed behind glass as evidence of Viking-era living conditions. There is something both absurd and deeply humanizing about this. The Viking Age is full of heroic narratives, sagas, battles, explorations, kingdoms won and lost. And in the middle of all that epic material, there is a Coppergate toilet and a Viking who needed medication they had no access to, going about their day in a city of 20 to 30,000 people, connected by trade to Baghdad and by ancestry to Norway, miserable with parasites, not thinking about history at all. Section 18. The Staffordshire, Hoard and the Riddle of Intent. On the 8th of July, 2009, a man named Terry Herbert was searching a field in Staffordshire with a metal detector. The field had recently been ploughed, and Herbert was methodically crossing and recrossing it. After several finds, he reached a point where the signals became so dense that he called a halt, contacted the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and reported what he had found. What he had found was the Staffordshire Hoard, the largest collection of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver ever discovered. Over 5 kilograms of gold, over 1.5 kilograms of silver, approximately 400 kilograms of soil removed from the field over subsequent excavations, yielding a total of 3,500 items and item fragments. The contents of the Staffordshire hoard are overwhelmingly military in character. Sword pommel caps, hilt plates, hilt guards, sword rings, helmet fragments, and other weapon fittings dominate the collection. There are also a small number of non-military items, including a strip of gold with a biblical inscription and a small cross that may have been a processional or altarpiece. But the military character of the hoard is unmistakable. This is the treasure of warriors, specifically the decorative fittings stripped from weapons. And that stripping is important. The objects in the hoard are not complete weapons. They are the gold and silver decorations removed from the hilts and scabbards of swords and other weapons. The swords themselves are absent. What was buried was the valuable metal fittings, while the weapons themselves, presumably the iron blades and wooden hafts, were not included. Why would you strip the decorations from swords and bury them without burying the swords? Various explanations have been proposed. The most dramatic suggests that the hoard represents the plunder of a great battle, a military victory so overwhelming that the victors stripped the weapons of the defeated, took the precious metal fittings as portable wealth, and buried them for safekeeping, perhaps intending to retrieve them later. On this interpretation, the hoard is war booty, carried off from a battlefield and hidden before it could be recovered and distributed. The dates of the objects, based on the stylistic analysis, span roughly from 550 to 650 AD, placing the hoard in the period of Mercian expansion and the conflicts between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Mercia, the kingdom whose territory included Staffordshire, was particularly aggressive during this period, absorbing neighbouring kingdoms and fighting the Welsh kingdoms to the west. Some researchers have connected the hoard to specific historical events. The Battle of the River Idle in 616 AD, where the Mercians defeated the Northumbrians, or other well-documented conflicts of the period. But the identification of a specific battle with a specific hoard is always speculative, and the date range of the objects in the Staffordshire hoard is wide enough that no single event can be definitively identified. The biblical inscription on the gold strip is in Latin and reads, translating from Vulgate, "Rise up, O Lord, and may thy enemies be dispersed, and those who hate thee be driven from thy face." This is a warrior's prayer, an invocation for divine support in battle. It is a reminder that the Anglo-Saxon world was not neatly divided between pagan warriors and Christian clergy. Warrior culture and Christian faith coexisted in ways that modern sensibility sometimes finds surprising, and the combination of warrior equipment with Christian inscription in the Staffordshire hoard reflects that coexistence perfectly. The hoard has been the subject of extensive conservation work and scholarly analysis since its discovery, and several aspects remain contentious. The question of whether the hoard was deposited in a single event or accumulated over time has not been resolved. The question of whether it was a deliberate burial or an emergency cache hidden during a crisis is also open. And the question of who buried it, whether a victorious warrior, a defeated king, a looter, or a treasured storekeeper, is completely unknown. What is not in doubt is the quality of the objects. The craftsmanship on display in the Staffordshire hoard is of the highest order achievable in the Anglo-Saxon world. The garnet cloisonné work on the sword fittings requires the cutting and setting of tiny pieces of garnet in gold cells, with a precision that demands specialist training, specialist tools, and excellent eyesight. The filigree work, where gold wire is twisted and shaped into complex patterns and soldered onto a background, is similarly technically demanding. This was not craft production for general consumption. These were objects made by masters of their craft for the most powerful and wealthy members of society. The swords they decorated were the swords of warriors at the apex of Anglo-Saxon social hierarchy. And somehow, buried in a field in Staffordshire, this concentration of high-status material survived for 14 centuries, until Terry Herbert's metal detector found it. The Staffordshire hoard is now displayed at the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery and the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent, split between the two institutions. The total number of individual items continues to grow as conservators separate fragments that were originally stuck together, and the process of analysis and interpretation is ongoing. Terry Herbert, the man who found it, received a share of the valuation of £3.285 million. He had been unemployed at the time of the discovery. Section 19. The Skara Brae Mystery. A village preserved by storm on the Bay of Scale on the western coast of Orkney. A great storm in the winter of 1850 stripped the grass from a large sand dune, revealing the walls of ancient stone buildings underneath. The landowner, William Watt, began excavations, and over subsequent years, a remarkable site emerged from beneath the sand. Skara Brae is a Neolithic village. It consists of 8 stone-built houses linked by covered stone passages dating to approximately 3200 to 2200 BC. It is almost exactly contemporary with the building of the pyramids at Giza. And it is because of the remarkable preservation conditions of the Orkney sand, the best preserved Neolithic village in Northern Europe. When we say well preserved, we mean it. The stone furniture survives. Inside the houses at Skara Brae, you can see the stone beds, the stone dressers, the stone seats, the stone storage boxes sunk into the floor. The villagers slept in stone beds, presumably filled with heather or bracken. They stored things in stone dressers, probably decorated with whatever personal possessions they valued most. They had a central hearth for heat and light. They had covered drains beneath the floors, a sophisticated sanitation system. These were not primitive huts. They were engineered dwellings with drainage, with fixed furniture, with a specific interior layout that was repeated house to house with enough consistency to suggest a community with shared standards of domestic design. The uniformity of the houses at Skara Brae is worth dwelling on. Each house has the same basic layout: central hearth, beds on either side, dresser on the far wall from the entrance, and a small side cell, usually interpreted as a toilet. The similarity is so strong that an archaeologist who has studied one house at Skara Brae can navigate any of the others blindfolded. This was not a community where each household built its own dwelling in whatever way suited it. This was a community with a shared domestic culture precise enough to be reproduced consistently in stone. The objects found at Skara Brae include carved stone balls, which are found at several Neolithic sites in Scotland and whose function remains unknown, personal ornaments made from bone and ivory, pottery of a distinctive Orkney style called grooved ware, and various stone tools. There are no weapons. This is not remarkable in itself. Warfare existed in Neolithic Scotland, but the absence of obvious military equipment is consistent with the interpretation of Skara Brae as a community organized around cooperative domestic and perhaps ceremonial life rather than inter-community violence. The abandonment of Skara Brae is itself a mystery. The site appears to have been abandoned relatively quickly, possibly following a storm similar to the one that eventually buried it. When the houses were excavated, objects were found scattered on the floors, as though dropped and left in a hurry. Beads from a broken necklace strewn across the floor, tools left in the middle of tasks. Whether this represents a sudden storm event that forced evacuation, or whether the abandonment was more gradual and the scattered objects are an artifact of how the site was later disturbed, has been debated. What is clear is that the community at Skara Brae was part of a wider Orcadian Neolithic culture that built the Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stennis, the Barnhouse Settlement, and the tomb of Mai Sho, all within a few miles of one another. The Neolithic Orkney complex is one of the most remarkable concentrations of prehistoric monuments in the world, designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it represents a level of social organization, artistic sophistication, and communal investment that we are still working to fully appreciate. What was Orkney doing at the center of Neolithic culture? Geographically, it sits at the northern edge of Britain, exposed to the North Sea on one side and the Atlantic on the other. It is, in modern terms, remote and peripheral. But in the Neolithic period, when travel was primarily by sea, Orkney may have been ideally situated at the centre of a sea route network connecting the coastal and island communities of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland. The sea was a highway, not a barrier, and Orkney, at the point where those highways met, may have been the centre, rather than the periphery it appears to be when viewed from a modern land-based perspective. That reorientation from land-based to sea-based thinking changes the geography of Neolithic Britain dramatically. The places that were most accessible, most connected, most central, were not the inland areas, but the coastal communities and islands. Orkney, the Western Isles, the coasts of Wales and Cornwall, Ireland, Brittany in France. These were the nodes of the network, and the monuments clustered at these nodes reflect their centrality to the culture that built them. Section 20, the medieval mystery. What lies beneath English cathedrals? British cathedrals are among the great works of medieval architecture. Canterbury, York, Lincoln, Wells, Salisbury. These buildings represent extraordinary investments of resources, skill, and collective purpose that rival anything produced in the ancient world. But beneath them, within them, and around them lies an accumulated archaeology that spans from the Roman period to the present and includes finds of extraordinary significance that rarely get the attention they deserve. Winchester Cathedral is built over the remains of a Roman building, its own Saxon predecessor, and a Norman church. Its crypt is one of the finest Norman architectural spaces in Britain. And in 2016, during routine maintenance work, conservators discovered something in the mortuary chests that line the presbytery. The jumbled bones of multiple individuals, many of them clearly associated with the historical records of Anglo-Saxon and Norman royalty, buried at Winchester. The mortuary chests at Winchester were made in the early modern period to collect and preserve the bones of royalty and bishops buried in the cathedral over many centuries. The individuals represented were supposed to include King Cnut, Cynegils of Wessex, the earliest Christian king of Wessex, and Emma of Normandy, among others. When the chests were opened and analysed in detail, the bones were found to be thoroughly mixed, fragments of multiple individuals combined in each chest, with no clear separation between the historically identified individuals. Isotope and DNA analysis of the bones has provided fascinating, if incomplete, results. The bones include individuals consistent with royal status, well-nourished, and of apparently high social position. Some of the DNA is consistent with Scandinavian ancestry, which would be expected for Cnut's line. But the thoroughness of the mixing, a result of repeated historical disturbances, including parliamentary troops, during the English Civil War, throwing the bones around the cathedral in a deliberate act of desecration, means that definitive identification of specific individuals has proven extremely difficult. York Minster sits over one of the most complex archaeological sequences in Britain. The Roman fortress of Eboracum, one of the most important military bases in Roman Britain, underlies the medieval city of York. The legionary headquarters building, the Principia, lies directly beneath York Minster. Excavations beneath the Minster in the 1960s and 1970s, undertaken because the building was in structural difficulty and required underpinning, revealed the Roman Principia in extraordinary detail, including the Great Hall, the administrative rooms, and the well-preserved floor levels. But the most dramatic discovery beneath York Minster was not Roman, but Viking. The excavations revealed remains of the Viking-era Cathedral of St. Peter, predecessor to the medieval minster, including structural timbers preserved in the waterlogged ground and decorative stonework from the pre-Norman building. At Canterbury Cathedral, the excavations that have been conducted over decades beneath the nave and around the exterior have revealed the sequence of Saxon and Roman buildings that preceded the Norman structure. The site of the cathedral's high altar is approximately the location of the Roman Forum of Duravernum, the Roman town of Canterbury. The sacred geography of Canterbury, in other words, has been continuous from the Roman period through the Saxon period into the medieval and modern. Each successive religious community recognized the significance of the place and rebuilt on the same site. This is a pattern seen repeatedly in British sacred geography. Significant places remaining significant across religious and cultural changes. The water of Bath was sacred before the Romans built their temple and after they left. The hills of Avebury were sacred in the Neolithic, and their significance was remembered into the medieval period in the landscape names and folklore. The cathedral sites of Canterbury, York, and Winchester mark places that were significant in the Roman period, and perhaps before. What was it about these places that made them repeatedly worthy of the community's greatest architectural effort? The Roman explanations were strategic and administrative. The Saxon explanations were missionary and royal. The medieval explanations were theological. But the places themselves seem to have possessed a quality of significance that transcended the explanations imposed on them by any single culture. Maybe the most honest thing to say is that we do not fully know why these places were sacred. We know they were. We can observe the layering of successive sacredness across the archaeological record. But the quality that made a particular hill or spring or river crossing the right place for a temple or a cathedral, that quality remains partially opaque to us. There is perhaps a lesson there about the limits of the purely rational explanation of human behavior. Some things are built where they are built because someone felt very strongly that this was the right place. And 4,000 years later, or 2,000, or 1,000, someone else builds on the same spot because they feel very strongly that this is the right place. The reasons change, the feeling persists. Section 21. The Lindo Man and the Triple Death. On the 6th of August, 1984, workers at a peat processing plant in Cheshire were feeding compressed peat into a machine when it stopped working. They investigated and found that the machine had been blocked by a piece of organic material that had passed through the peat shredder and had been identified by one of the workers as a human foot. Further investigation revealed that the foot was attached to a leg, and the leg was attached to more of a body, preserved in the peat of Lindo moss in extraordinary detail. The resulting corpse, recovered with extreme care over the following days, became known as Lindo Man, and he is now one of the most thoroughly studied human remains in the world. Lindo Man was a young man, probably in his mid-20s from the Iron Age. The precision of the dating varies with different analyses, but the most likely period is somewhere between 2 BC and 119 AD, with a probability peak around the 1st century AD. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall, well built, with a trimmed beard and carefully maintained fingernails, which indicates he did not perform heavy manual labor. He ate a meal shortly before he died. An examination of his stomach contents revealed he had eaten a griddle cake made of various grains, which was slightly burned. He ate his last meal outdoors or near a fire. His death was elaborate. He was struck on the top of the head, twice with a blunt instrument, hard enough to crack the skull. His throat was cut, and he was strangled with a cord, a twisted sinew garrote that was still in place around his neck when he was found. 3 different methods of killing were applied to the same individual. This combination of violence has a specific name in the scholarly literature: the Triple Death. The concept appears in Celtic mythology, where certain deaths, specifically the deaths of sacred kings or important sacrificial victims, required three forms of killing simultaneously. The medieval Irish tale cycles include references to figures who must die three ways at once. The combination of bludgeoning, cutting, and strangulation on Lindo Man matches this mythological pattern so precisely that the interpretation of ritual sacrifice has become the dominant scholarly explanation. This is not universally accepted. Some researchers prefer to see Lindo Man as the victim of criminal violence or judicial execution, rather than ritual sacrifice. The precise nature of what constitutes ritual versus other forms of killing is contested in archaeology generally, and in the interpretation of bog bodies specifically. But the evidence for special treatment is compelling, beyond the threefold violence. The burned griddle cake in his stomach, slightly charred as if cooked hastily or ceremonially, has been interpreted as a death cake, analogous to examples in folklore and mythology where a specially prepared food is given to someone chosen for sacrifice. The careful maintenance of his body and hands, suggesting someone not used to hard work, points to a higher status individual, perhaps someone specifically maintained and prepared for a sacrificial role. And there is the location. Lindo Moss, the peat bog where Lindo Man was deposited, sits close to the boundary between territories that would later be identified as belonging to different Celtic tribal groups. Boundaries were liminal places in Celtic cosmology, places between worlds, places where transactions with the supernatural were appropriate. The deposition of a sacrificed individual in a boundary wetland fits the pattern of water deposition we discussed earlier, combined with the mythological significance of the threshold between territories. Lindo Man is not alone. Britain's bogs have produced over 100 bog bodies, though most are fragmentary. The Tolland Man in Denmark and the Grauballer Man, also Danish, are the most famous European examples, but the British examples are significant. Worsley Man, found in Greater Manchester, was decapitated and the head placed back with the body. Lindo III is a set of remains, possibly from a different individual than Lindo Man, or possibly parts of the same body, separated by the peat-cutting machinery, that show evidence of similar treatment. The preservation provided by the acid, anaerobic conditions of peat bogs is extraordinary. Soft tissue, including skin, internal organs, and in some cases the contents of the stomach, is preserved in ways impossible in normal burial conditions. The result is that the archaeology of bog bodies is intimate in a way that most prehistoric archaeology is not. We can see these people. We can examine their last meals. We can read the marks of their deaths in their physical remains. Lindo Man's face is recognizable. Whatever calculations and cosmological necessities led to his death, he was a person. He ate a burned piece of griddle cake. He had trimmed his nails. He did not do heavy work. He was someone's child, someone's colleague, someone known and named in his community. And then, for reasons that made complete sense to the people involved, he was killed three ways and placed in a bog. The gap between his reality and our ability to fully understand the cultural logic that led to his death is one of the most vivid illustrations of the limits of archaeological interpretation. We can describe what happened with great precision. We cannot quite reach the meaning. Section 22. Hadrian's Wall and the Civilization. It divided in 122 AD. The Emperor Hadrian visited Britain and ordered the construction of a wall across the north of England, from the Solway Firth in the west to the Tyne estuary in the east. The wall, which took roughly 8 years to build and was then modified and strengthened multiple times over the following centuries, stretched for approximately 117 kilometers. It was the most heavily fortified frontier in the Roman Empire. The wall was not simply a barrier. It was a complex military and administrative system that incorporated a series of forts positioned at regular intervals, each capable of housing a garrison of 500 to 1,000 soldiers. Between the forts were smaller fortlets at every mile, the so-called mile castles, and between those were turrets for observation and communication. To the south of the wall was a wide flat-bottomed ditch, the vallum, which defined the military zone. To the north was another ditch. The scale of construction required to build all of this in 8 years was enormous. Estimates suggest that over 15 million stones were quarried, transported, and laid. The workforce came primarily from the Roman legions stationed in Britain, supplemented by auxiliary units from across the empire, Batavians from what is now the Netherlands, Asturians from Spain, Tungrians from Belgium, Hamian archers from Syria. Hadrian's Wall was, in other words, manned by soldiers from across the known world and built with the engineering capacity of the most organized army the Western world had produced. The structure they left behind, still visible in places as a standing wall several courses high, remains one of the most impressive military monuments in Europe. But the archaeology of Hadrian's Wall tells stories that go well beyond its military function. The communities that grew up along and around the wall, the Vichy or civilian settlements attached to the forts, were complex, cosmopolitan, and unexpected. At Vindolanda, the fort just south of the wall, the waterlogged ground has preserved thousands of wooden writing tablets, the Vindolanda tablets, which provide an extraordinary window into daily life on the frontier. The tablets are not official military dispatches. They are personal letters, administrative records, shopping lists, birthday party invitations, military strength returns, and requests for supplies. One tablet, written by a soldier's wife named Claudia Severa to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, wife of the Vindolanda commander, is the oldest surviving letter written by a woman in Latin and one of the oldest personal letters written by a woman in any language. It invites Sulpicia Lepidina to celebrate her birthday and ends with what scholars believe is Claudia Severa's own handwriting in a postscript, after the main body of the letter was written by a scribe. I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail. Sister, my dearest soul, the warmth of that friendship, expressed in Latin on a thin piece of wood in the 2nd century AD at the edge of the Roman world, is astonishing. These women were real. They had friendships they valued. They wrote to each other, and one of those letters survived, buried in the anaerobic conditions of the Vindolanda waterlogged deposits for 19 centuries, until archaeologists found it in 1973. The Vindolanda tablets also tell us about supply chains, about logistics, about the day-to-day administration of a frontier fort. There are references to shortages of supplies. There are requisitions for additional socks and underpants, the northern frontier being cold. There are requests for additional men to complete construction work. There are mentions of the Britunculi, a diminutive and contemptuous word for the local Britons. Little Brits, used by a Roman officer reporting on the fighting style of local warriors. That contemptuous diminutive is a reminder that Hadrian's Wall was also a statement of cultural hierarchy. The wall divided, in Roman thinking, the civilized south from the barbarous north. The people on one side were subject to Roman law, Roman taxation, Roman cultural expectations. The people on the other side were not, and the Romans both feared and despised them. But the wall was also permeable. There was trade through the wall, controlled through the mile castle gates. Local people sold goods to the garrison. Locals worked for the Roman administration. Over the nearly 3 centuries of the wall's operation, there must have been a constant cross-border exchange of people, goods, and ideas that the simple image of a dividing wall does not capture. One remarkable find from the Hadrian's Wall zone illustrates this complexity. At the fort of Maryport on the Cumbrian coast, a series of altars was found, dedicated by the commanders of the garrison to the god Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The altars were buried in a pit, apparently ritually deposited after they had served their purpose, perhaps when each commanding officer left and was replaced by his successor. The sequence of altars provides a detailed record of the succession of officers who commanded the garrison, and analysis of their names and origins reveals a fascinating mixture. Men from Italy, Gaul, Africa, the Danube provinces, and the local British aristocracy, all serving in the same fort, all making the same offering to the king of the Roman gods. The Roman Empire at the edge of Britain was genuinely imperial in the sense of bringing together people from across a vast geographical range. The soldiers who built the wall and manned it for nearly 300 years were not Romans in any ethnic sense. They were soldiers of the Roman army from dozens of different origins, many of whom settled on the frontier after their service, married local women, raised families, and became part of the communities that grew up around the wall. Their descendants are still here, in the communities of Cumbria and Northumberland. In the genetics of northern England, there is DNA contributed by Syrian archers, Batavian cavalry, Spanish infantry, and African administrators. The empire left no clean lines. Section 23. The Lost Languages of Britain. Most people are aware that Britain has had multiple languages in its history, that Gaelic was spoken before English, that Latin was imposed by Rome. But the full linguistic history of Britain is far stranger, more layered and more complex than this simplified picture suggests. Before the Celtic languages arrived in Britain, sometime in the first millennium, BC, or possibly earlier, what was spoken here, we do not know with certainty. There are place names and river names in Britain that cannot be explained as Celtic, Latin, Anglo-Saxon, Norse, or any other identified language group. The River Wye, the River Exe, the River Axe, the element Avon in multiple river names across Britain, these and others appear to derive from a linguistic stratum older than the Celtic languages that are the oldest well-attested languages of Britain. This hypothetical pre-Celtic language, or languages, is sometimes called Proto-Celtic, or, more controversially, Old European, and it appears to have left its mark primarily in river names, which are notoriously conservative and tend to survive through linguistic changes that replace other vocabulary. Rivers had names before the Celts arrived. The people who spoke the earlier language told their children the names of the rivers, and the Celtic speakers adopted those names into their own linguistic system. What was the pre-Celtic language of Britain? We simply do not know. The fragmentary evidence from river names and a few other place name elements is not enough to reconstruct even the basic grammar or vocabulary of the language. It was spoken, it left traces, and then it was replaced, either by conquest or by gradual absorption. And except for those traces in the river, names it has left no recoverable record. Cornish is a language that nearly died and is now being actively revived. The last native speaker of Cornish, Dolly Pentreath, died in 1777. According to traditional accounts, though this is disputed, with some evidence suggesting other native speakers persisted slightly longer, Cornish is a Brythonic Celtic language related to Welsh and Breton, and it was the dominant language of Cornwall until the medieval period when English gradually replaced it. The revival of Cornish began in the early 20th century and has been ongoing since. Today, several hundred people speak Cornish as a second language. There are Cornish medium classes and events, and the language is recognised as a living minority language by the UK government. The question of which historical form of Cornish to revive, given that the language changed across its documented history and different reconstructors prefer different periods, has produced ongoing debate in the revival community. The Cornish revival is part of a broader pattern of Celtic language revival in Britain. Welsh, which never fell out of use as a community language, has been supported by official bilingual policy in Wales since 1967 and is now compulsory in Welsh schools. Scottish Gaelic, spoken by a small community primarily in the Western Isles, has been supported by Gaelic media and education initiatives. Manx Gaelic, the Celtic language of the Isle of Man, which had its last native speaker die in 1974, has also been revived to a limited extent. These languages are not archaeological curiosities. They are living systems of communication being maintained, and in some cases recovered, by communities that feel a connection to them. But they also preserve, in their vocabulary and idiom, traces of ways of seeing and describing the world that differ from the dominant English perspective in ways that are linguistically interesting. The Welsh word for emotion, teimlo, is also the word for touching with the hands, for feeling physically. The connection between physical sensation and emotional experience is built into the language in a way that English, which distinguishes feel in the physical sense from feel in the emotional sense more cleanly, does not quite replicate. These are different ways of carving up experience through language. The Cornish language had words for types of weather, for states of the landscape, for conditions of the sea and coast, that reflected generations of observation of a specific environment. Some of those words have no English equivalent. When Cornish fell out of use, those specific descriptions of the Cornish environment went with it. The revival effort is partly an attempt to recover them. Language is not just a communication tool. It is an accumulated record of how a community has learned to see and describe its world, built up over generations of collective experience. When a language dies, that record is lost in ways that are not fully recoverable, even when the language itself is revived from written sources. Britain has lost languages, not just the unnamed pre-Celtic speech preserved in river names, but documented languages. Pictish, Cumbric, a Brythonic language spoken in northern England and southern Scotland until the medieval period, and others. Each loss is a loss of a worldview, a way of describing and organizing experience that was built up over centuries and then extinguished. The recovery of these lost languages is one of the more poignant and determined acts of historical imagination being undertaken in modern Britain. Section 24. The Chalk That Speaks. Written Traces of the Ancient World. The earliest known written text from Britain is in Latin, which dates the written record to the Roman period, after 43 AD. Before that, Britain had no writing in any conventional sense, no system of recording language, visually, that we have been able to recover. This is often cited as one of the dividing lines between prehistoric and historic Britain. But the absence of writing does not mean an absence of recorded information. And in the years since the development of modern isotopic and genetic analysis techniques, it has become possible to read the past from sources that are entirely non-textual. Ancient DNA has transformed the study of prehistoric Britain in ways that were unimaginable 30 years ago. In 2018, a landmark study analyzed the genomes of 93 prehistoric Britons, comparing their genetic profiles to known populations across Europe. The results were extraordinary. They showed, with considerable clarity, that the population of Britain underwent a massive genetic replacement at the beginning of the Neolithic period, around 4000 BC, when farming arrived. The hunter-gatherers who had inhabited Britain since the end of the last ice age, with their dark skin, blue eyes, and dark hair as reconstructed from genomic analysis, were almost entirely replaced by incoming farmers from the continent who had ultimately originated in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Neolithic farmers who replaced the hunter-gatherers had lighter skin, dark eyes, and dark hair, and they brought with them not just farming, but a suite of new practices and beliefs that included megalithic monument building, new pottery traditions, and the communal burial practices we see in the long barrows and passage tombs of Britain. Then came another wave. Around 2500 BC, at the beginning of the Bronze Age, the genetic record shows another massive population replacement. People carrying what geneticists call the Yamnaya ancestry, ultimately derived from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, arrived in Britain and within a few centuries had replaced the majority of the Neolithic farming population. These steppe people brought the bell beaker culture, metallurgy, the Proto-Indo-European language that would eventually evolve into Celtic and then into English, and apparently a competitive advantage that allowed them to displace or absorb the existing population with remarkable rapidity. The speed of these replacements is among the most surprising aspects of the ancient DNA results. These were not gradual admixtures over thousands of years. They were fast, dramatic events. The genetic profile of Britain around 2500 BC was almost unrecognizable compared to 2800 BC. What caused such rapid population change? Was it disease, to which the incoming population had immunity and the existing population did not? Was it organized conquest? Was it economic competition that the existing population lost catastrophically? We do not know. The genetics tell us the replacement happened. They do not tell us the mechanism. But the implications are profound. The people who built Stonehenge, the Neolithic farmers who erected the great megalithic monuments of Britain, are not the primary genetic ancestors of modern British people. They were replaced. Their genes survive in modern Europeans at a very low level, but the direct cultural and genetic connection that a modern British person has with the builders of Stonehenge is largely broken. This is uncomfortable information for those who would like a simple story of continuity, a direct line of descent from the ancient monument builders to the present inhabitants of the island. The story is not simple. It is one of replacement, of complex admixture, of multiple waves of new populations superimposed on or displacing previous ones. And yet there is continuity too, at a cultural level that genetics does not capture. The monuments are still there. The sacred sites are still visited. The landscape shaped by Neolithic and Bronze Age hands is still the landscape of Britain. The connection is not genetic, but it is real. A landscape and its layered history, shared by communities who have lived within it and given it meaning across thousands of years. The Bronze Age, steppe immigrants who replaced the Neolithic farmers maintained Stonehenge. They buried their dead near it. They continued to make it the center of a sacred landscape in ways that suggest they recognized and adopted its significance, even though they had not built it. The monument survived the replacement of the people who built it because the new inhabitants of Britain found it meaningful, whatever its original builders had intended by it. That continuity of place, across breaks in population, across changes in language and culture and religion, is one of the most remarkable features of British history. The landscape holds the memory of those who shaped it, even when the people who shaped it are gone. Section 25, the Warren Field Calendar. Scotland's Mesolithic Lunar Monument. In 2013, archaeologists working at Warren Field near Craith's Castle in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, published the results of analysis that reframed what was thought possible in the Mesolithic period. The site had been known for some years, first identified from aerial photographs that showed crop marks indicating subsurface features. Excavation had revealed a series of pits, 12 of them arranged in an arc approximately 50 meters long. The pits were radiocarbon, dated to between approximately 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, placing them firmly in the Mesolithic period, long before farming arrived in Britain, long before the megalithic monuments, long before anything we typically associate with organized astronomy. But the analysis of the pit arrangement produced a startling conclusion. The 12 pits correspond in shape to the 12 months of the lunar year. They are arranged to mimic the waxing and waning of the moon across a year, with the arc of pits representing the lunar months sequentially. And the arc as a whole is oriented so that it aligns with the midwinter sunrise. The archaeologists who published the analysis were careful in their language. They described the pits as a time-reckoning device, specifically as a lunar calendar that incorporated a solar corrective mechanism. The midwinter sunrise alignment would have allowed users to correct their count of lunar months against the solar year, preventing the calendar from drifting out of synchrony with the seasons over time. This is exactly how sophisticated lunisolar calendars work. The Jewish calendar, the Islamic calendar, the Hindu calendar, and many others all use mechanisms to keep lunar months in alignment with the solar year, because the solar year does not divide neatly into lunar months. 12 lunar months are slightly shorter than a solar year, and without correction, a purely lunar calendar drifts through the seasons over time. The Warren Field pits appear to represent a pre-agricultural British community that had developed a lunisolar calendar, an understanding of the relationship between lunar months and the solar year, sophisticated enough to require a corrective mechanism expressed in a physical structure oriented to the midwinter sunrise. The people who dug these pits were hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no permanent settlements by most definitions, no pottery, no metallurgy. They are classified by the categories of prehistory as belonging to the simplest phase of post-glacial human culture. And they built a device for tracking the relationship between the moon and the sun over a yearly cycle, aligned to an astronomical event, capable of keeping their calendar accurate across multiple years. This is not the behavior we predict for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. It is the behavior of people who need, very specifically, to know what time of year it is, because the timing of migratory animal movements, the flowering of specific plants, the running of specific fish are all seasonally specific and vitally important to communities living by hunting and gathering. A calendar is not a luxury for hunter-gatherers. It is an essential survival tool. The Warren Field calendar was not built out of intellectual curiosity or religious sentiment, though it may have incorporated both. It was built because knowing the lunar date in relation to the solar year was practically important to the people who built it. And knowing that it was important, understanding the need it served, makes the sophistication of the solution even more impressive rather than less. These were not primitive people stumbling onto calendar making by accident. They were sophisticated observers of the sky, maintaining knowledge across generations and constructing durable physical devices to hold that knowledge in a form that could be consulted and used. The Warren Field calendar is currently the oldest known lunar calendar in the world. It predates the formal calendars of Mesopotamia and Egypt by thousands of years. It was made in Scotland by people who left no other trace of their presence except the pits they dug and the charcoal they left in the ground. They knew what month it was. They knew the sun would rise where it always rose on the midwinter morning. They built something that would tell them both, and then they moved on, as hunter-gatherers do, leaving the device behind in the earth, where it waited 8,000 years for archaeologists with aerial cameras to notice the crop marks it left in a barley field. Section 26. The Boudican Revolt and the Archaeology of Destruction. In 60 or 61 AD, a queen of the Iceni tribe of what is now Norfolk led a revolt against Roman rule that remains one of the most dramatic episodes in British history. Her name was Boudica. Her army destroyed Camulodunum, modern Colchester, Londinium, modern London, and Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Roman sources suggest tens of thousands of people were killed. The revolt was eventually suppressed by the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, who defeated Boudica's army in a pitched battle whose location is still debated. The Roman account, written by Tacitus and Cassius Dio, presents Boudica as a powerful warrior queen, wronged by Roman misadministration and seeking violent revenge, who comes close to destroying Roman Britain before being defeated. The archaeology of the Boudican revolt is startlingly visible. In London, beneath the streets of the city, At depths that vary with the slope of the land, there is a distinctive layer of red burnt debris, a stratum of burned daub, charcoal, and ash that dates precisely to around 60 AD. It is called the Boudiccan destruction layer, and it marks the event of the burning of Londinium in a way that requires no interpretation. Where the layer exists, the city was burned. The surface below it represents the pre-revolt settlement. The surface above it represents the rebuilding after the revolt. The layer has been found across a wide area of the City of London during construction work over many decades. Its extent gives us the rough boundaries of the first-century settlement, the Roman Londinium that Boudicca destroyed. It was not a large city by later standards, but it was significant enough to destroy. A trading settlement and administrative centre, established less than 20 years before the revolt. What the destruction layer contains is a frozen moment, the material record of a settlement as it was in 60 AD. Pottery, glass, metal objects, organic material, all sealed beneath the layer of destruction and its subsequent rebuilding, represent a snapshot of mid-first century London life that archaeologists have spent decades interpreting. At Camulodunum, the destruction is similarly visible. Colchester was the first Roman colony in Britain, established in 49 AD on the site of the British tribal capital of Camulodunum. It was a major symbolic target for Boudicca, housing as it did a temple to the deified Claudius, the emperor who had ordered the invasion of Britain, which functioned as a focal point for Roman colonial power. The excavations at Colchester over many decades have revealed the destruction horizon of the Boudiccan revolt in multiple locations. Burned debris, melted glass, the remains of buildings destroyed in a single catastrophic event, all dating to around 60 AD. And within the destruction layers, preserved by the burning and the rapid dumping of debris afterward, are extraordinary organic materials that would not normally survive. Seeds, grain, wooden objects, leather, textile fragments, the normal perishable rubbish of a Roman town preserved accidentally by the fire that destroyed everything else. The scale of the Boudiccan revolt, as described by Tacitus, who claims 70 or 80,000 people were killed across the three destroyed cities, is probably exaggerated in the way Roman numerical claims routinely are. But the revolt was clearly a significant military event, one that came close to ending the Roman occupation of Britain. Tacitus's account suggests that Suetonius Paulinus considered abandoning London, calculating that he could not defend it with the forces available, and the city was evacuated before Boudicca's army arrived. The ordinary inhabitants of Londinium who could not evacuate in time, the elderly, the infirm, those who chose to remain in hopes that the revolt would be suppressed before the army arrived, were killed when the city burned. They left no record of their individual deaths, but the burned layer they lie beneath, or the objects they left behind in a hurry as they fled, exist still in the record. One particularly poignant find from the Boudiccan layer in London is a collection of pottery and personal objects that appear to have been dropped or left in a dwelling as the owner fled or was overwhelmed. Among them was a small bronze figure of a seated woman, a personal object of the kind that would have been a household decoration or perhaps a religious figurine. Its owner left it behind. It sat in the burned debris for 2,000 years before being recovered in the 20th century. She had a bronze woman in her home. She left in a hurry, or she did not leave at all. The city burned. 2,000 years passed. We found her bronze woman. That small object connects us to the violence of 60 AD more directly than any historical text. It is not a symbol or a statistic. It is a thing that belonged to someone, abandoned in a specific moment of terror and fire, preserved by the catastrophe that overwhelmed its owner. Section 27. The Great Orme Copper, Mines and the Bronze Age Industry, that shocked scientists. On the northern coast of Wales, overlooking the Irish Sea, there is a limestone headland called the Great Orme. It is now a tourist destination, a country park, the terminus of an antiquated cable tramway, known for its wild goats and its spectacular views. But beneath the Great Orme, in a labyrinth of tunnels that was not fully recognized as archaeological until the 1980s, lies one of the most significant industrial sites in Bronze Age Europe. The copper mines of the Great Orme were worked in the Bronze Age, beginning around 1800 BC and continuing for at least 6 centuries. When archaeologists began systematic investigation of the mine system in the 1990s, the scale of what they found was astonishing. The known extent of the Bronze Age mine workings runs to approximately 8 kilometers of tunnels and galleries, reaching depths of 70 meters below the modern surface. More tunnels are probably still to be found. The quantity of copper ore extracted from these mines during the Bronze Age has been estimated at around 1,700 tons of copper metal, which would have required the extraction and processing of approximately 25,000 tons of ore. This is not a cottage industry. This is industrial-scale mining, organized and operated over centuries, with all the logistics of ore extraction, surface processing, and distribution that implies. The mines were worked by people using stone hammers, bone tools, and fire setting, the technique of building a fire against the rock face and then quenching it with cold water or vinegar to crack the rock. The tools recovered from the mine workings are extraordinary in their quantity. Thousands of stone hammers, hundreds of bone tools made from the bones of cattle and red deer, and charcoal from the fires used in fire setting. Analysis of the mine ventilation system, which is identifiable from the pattern of passages, shows that the Bronze Age miners had a sophisticated understanding of airflow underground. Passages were arranged to create natural draft, drawing fresh air in through lower passages and expelling foul air through upper ones. This was not accidental, it was engineered. The scale of the Great Orme operation changes how we should think about Bronze Age Britain's economic capacity. Producing 1,700 tons of copper required sustained, organized, multi-generational effort. It required workers to be fed, housed, and directed. It required the products of the mine to be distributed across a network that we can trace through the isotope analysis of Bronze Age metalwork. Great Orme copper turns up in bronze objects across Britain and continental Europe. There was probably a managerial class overseeing this operation, people whose job was not mining but organizing, sourcing food for workers, coordinating distribution, maintaining the trading relationships that ensured the copper was worth extracting. Bronze Age Britain had something approaching industrial management. The human cost of this industry is visible in the skeletal remains of Bronze Age individuals from the region. Miners' skeletons show specific patterns of skeletal stress, spinal compression, shoulder muscle attachment, hypertrophy, and repetitive strain injuries, consistent with the specific physical demands of underground mining and the swinging of heavy stone hammers. The mines created specific health consequences for the people who worked them. Some of the narrowest passages in the Great Orme mines are too small for an adult to enter comfortably. This is interpreted, by comparison with historical mining practices globally, as evidence that children worked in the mines, crawling through spaces too small for their parents to reach, either extracting ore from narrow seams or passing material from deep face to passage to surface. Child labour in British mines in the Bronze Age, 4,000 years before the Victorian reformers legislated against it in industrial coal mines, is the obvious and an uncomfortable implication. The Great Orme mines are one of those discoveries that force a fundamental revision of what Bronze Age Britain means. Not a landscape of isolated agricultural communities with a few prestigious elites. Something more complex, an economy with industrial production, long-distance trade networks, organized labor, including the labor of children, and the infrastructure of management and distribution that supports all of it. This was an economy, a real economy, with production, distribution, management, surplus, and presumably some form of economic organization that coordinated it all. Not a modern economy, not a capitalist economy, not anything we would recognize in its specifics, but an economy nonetheless, operating at a scale and sophistication that continues to astonish the researchers who study it. Section 28. The thing they found under Dorrington walls in 2020, aerial survey combined with ground-penetrating radar across the landscape immediately around Stonehenge, conducted as part of the ongoing Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project, produced a discovery that was described by one of the participating archaeologists as the most important discovery since the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. That is a significant claim. Let us examine whether it holds. Beneath the soil around Dorrington walls, a massive Neolithic henge enclosure located approximately 3 kilometers from Stonehenge, researchers identified a series of enormous pits. The pits are approximately 5 meters in diameter and at least 4 or 5 meters deep. They are arranged in a circle, or what appears to be a partial circle, with a radius of approximately 1.2 kilometers, centered on Dorrington walls. The known portion of the arrangement includes at least 20 pits, and geophysical survey suggests more may exist. The scale of these pits is extraordinary. They are each roughly the volume of a large house. They were cut into the chalk. They represent an enormous amount of work, and their arrangement, in a circle centered on a major Neolithic henge, strongly suggests they are deliberate rather than natural features. The dating of the pits, based on analysis of material from their fills, suggests a Neolithic age broadly contemporary with the Dorrington Walls henge and the earlier phases of Stonehenge. The geophysical data suggests they were open pits at some point, and their fills show the gradual accumulation of material over time rather than rapid, deliberate backfilling. What were they for? No one knows yet. The scale of the feature, a circle more than 2 kilometers in diameter, defined by enormous pits centered on a massive henge enclosure, that is itself close to Stonehenge, suggests it was part of the same monumental landscape that includes both Stonehenge and Dorrington walls. The entire area was a ceremonial landscape of extraordinary complexity, with features operating at different scales, from the individual stone to the landscape scale arrangement of monuments. The Dorrington walls, pits, if they are the size and date the survey suggests, represent the largest Neolithic structure ever identified in Britain. They make the Stonehenge and Avebury monuments look, if not small, then at least contained. This was a feature on a landscape scale, visible and meaningful from a distance, part of a sacred geography that extended across the entire Salisbury Plain and beyond. The discovery was made without excavation. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing techniques identified the pits from surface survey. This is increasingly the direction of archaeological discovery, not excavation, which is expensive, destructive, and time-consuming, but remote sensing, which can cover large areas rapidly and identify buried features without touching them. This means that the landscape around Britain's known prehistoric monuments is likely full of features we have not yet identified. The Stonehenge landscape, which has been studied intensively for over a century, still has major surprises under the surface. Other landscapes, less studied, almost certainly have more. What proportion of the prehistoric archaeology of Britain remains unexcavated and in many cases unknown? The honest answer is the vast majority of it. What has been found is impressive. What remains to be found is likely to transform our understanding of British prehistory multiple times over in the coming decades. We are still at the beginning. Section 29. The Silbury Hill Enigma. What is inside? Silbury Hill is the largest prehistoric mound in Europe. It rises 60 meters from the flat plain around it, occupies an area of roughly 2 hectares at its base, and contains an estimated 5 million cubic meters of chalk, soil, gravel, and turf. It was built in stages, beginning around 2400 BC and completed over several centuries. It stands at the heart of the Avebury ritual landscape, a massive presence that dominates the view for miles in every direction. It has been dug into 5 times. Once in 1776, when the Duke of Northumberland had a shaft sunk from the top of the hill to near the base, hoping to find a burial. Once in 1849, when a horizontal tunnel was driven in from the side to the centre of the mound. Once in 1968 and 1969, when the BBC and the archaeologist Richard Atkinson opened the 1849 tunnel and drove a new tunnel at a lower level, again hoping to find a central burial. And again in 2007 and 2008, when English Heritage undertook a comprehensive investigation using modern archaeological methods. No burial has ever been found in Silbury Hill. This is the central enigma of the monument. Silbury Hill is enormous. It dominates a landscape filled with burial monuments. It was built in phases over centuries, requiring an investment of labour that archaeologists have estimated at millions of person-hours. And it contains nothing, or at least nothing that has been found in 5 separate excavation campaigns using both Victorian and modern archaeological techniques. The 2007-2008 excavation, conducted to repair damage caused by the earlier tunnels and their subsequent deterioration, was the most comprehensive of the 5 investigations. It produced detailed information about the construction sequence of the mound, showing that it had grown in stages, with each phase adding a new outer layer of chalk and turf. The construction technique was sophisticated. Each layer was designed to be stable and to support the next, with drainage features and structural elements engineered into the core. The earliest phase, at the heart of the mound, was a much smaller structure of stacked turf, approximately 30 meters in diameter, built over what appears to have been a flat grassy surface with vegetation that was cut rather than stripped before the mound was started. The primary mound therefore preserves, in its base, the turf of the field as it was on the day construction began, around 2400 BC. That detail is remarkable. Deep in the heart of Silbury Hill, sealed by 5 million cubic meters of chalk, is a patch of the original land surface of the Avebury Plain in 2400 BC. Plants that were growing on that morning are still there, sealed and preserved. They have not seen daylight for 4,500 years. What was Silbury Hill for, if not as a burial? The theories are numerous. Some researchers have suggested it was a harvest monument, built in stages that correspond to the agricultural year, each stage perhaps representing a particular year's labour or offering. The presence of winged ants in the primary mound, which would have been present in late summer or early autumn, has been interpreted as evidence that construction began in that season, around harvest time. Others have proposed that Silbury Hill was a processional monument, a high place designed to be ascended in ceremonies, with the summit providing a dramatic viewpoint over the surrounding sacred landscape. The sight from the top of Silbury Hill encompasses the Ring of Brodgar's Orkney equivalent in visual terms. You can see in every direction across a landscape that includes Avebury, the Kennet Avenue, West Kennet Long Barrow, and the rolling chalk downs in every direction. Still others have argued that Silbury Hill was a territorial marker, a statement of community power visible across the landscape and demonstrating the organizational capacity and collective will of the community that built it. On this interpretation, the building was the point, not the contents. What Silbury Hill contained was not a burial or a ceremony, but the accumulated labor of a community, poured into the most durable form imaginable: chalk. The 2008 excavation produced one unexpected find that has attracted considerable attention. In the deposits immediately around the base of the mound, there were large quantities of freshwater snail shells. The snails appear to have been living in a marshy environment immediately around the base of the mound at the time of its construction, suggesting that the area was wetter in 2400 BC than it is today, and that Silbury Hill may have been built in a position surrounded by water, making it effectively an island. An island in the middle of a wet plain, at the center of the most complex ceremonial landscape in prehistoric Britain. The image shifts the interpretation subtly. Water was sacred, wetlands were liminal, islands were special. Silbury Hill, rising from a marsh or seasonal lake, would have been not just a landmark, but a very specific kind of landmark. A sacred mound in sacred water, accessible by boat at certain times of year. The visual center of a water-surrounded ceremonial complex. We do not know. And Silbury Hill, sitting in its field across the road from the village of Avebury, will probably keep its secret for at least a little longer. It has managed it for 4,500 years. Another few years of study seems unlikely to produce the definitive answer. But the question remains one of the most productive in British archaeology, precisely because attempting to answer it forces a rethinking of almost everything we thought we understood about the Neolithic people who built it. Section 30. The Lindisfarne Gospels and the Knowledge. That almost died in 715 AD, or thereabouts. A monk named Edfrith on the tidal island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast, began to write and illustrate a gospel book. He worked alone, without assistance, on a project that would take him years. The copying and illumination of the four Gospels of the New Testament in a style that combined the traditions of Mediterranean manuscript illumination with the native British and Irish traditions of interlace and zoomorphic decoration. The result is the Lindisfarne Gospels. It is difficult to describe the Lindisfarne Gospels adequately in prose. The carpet pages, where the entire page is filled with interlaced patterns of geometric and zoomorphic design, are among the most complex pattern-making achievements in the history of human art. The carpet page, at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, for example, contains patterns that, when unraveled, reveal continuous lines winding through the design for meters without repeating. The patterns are not mechanically produced. They were drawn freehand, though with the assistance of a stylus point compass for circles and possibly a ruler for straight sections, by a human hand, in ink, on vellum. Modern analysts who have attempted to replicate the Lindisfarne carpet pages report that the combination of spatial memory, manual dexterity, and pattern visualization ability required to produce them, even with the benefit of modern understanding of the underlying structure, is extraordinary. Edfrith was working by lamplight, in cold conditions, probably at times when his fingers were stiff. Using quill pens and inks he may have prepared himself to produce something whose geometric complexity has challenged professional mathematicians to describe. Why? What drove a monk to spend years producing an object of this difficulty and this beauty? The answer is partly theological. The gospel text was the Word of God, and the Word of God deserved the most beautiful presentation possible. The decoration was not mere ornament. It was an act of worship, a meditation in paint and ink on the content of the text being decorated, a visual prayer, running alongside the verbal prayer of the words themselves. But the Lindisfarne Gospels also represent something else. The meeting of cultures in early medieval Northumbria that produced something neither tradition alone could have achieved. The insular style of manuscript illumination, the style represented by the Lindisfarne Gospels and its close relatives, the Book of Kells and the Lichfield Gospels, is a hybrid creation. The interlace patterns derive from the metalwork traditions of the British and Irish Celtic world, traditions that reach back through the Iron Age to the Bronze Age. The zoomorphic elements, the animal forms that populate the margins and initial letters, draw on the same reservoir of artistic convention as the Pictish symbol stones and the decorative bronzes of the pre-Roman Iron Age. The layout conventions, the canon tables, the evangelist portraits, the use of gold and blue pigments, the Mediterranean approach to representing the human figure. These come from the Roman world, transmitted through the Christian Church, and the text itself comes from the Near East, a text in Latin translated from Greek, translated from Aramaic originals recording the words of a Jewish preacher in Roman Palestine, transmitted across half a world and 500 years to reach a monastery on a Northumbrian island. The Lindisfarne Gospels are a monument to the improbability of cultural survival and transmission. Every link in the chain that brought them into existence could have been broken. The tradition of manuscript illumination could have died in the chaos of the post-Roman period. The monasteries that preserved it could have been destroyed before the tradition was recorded and transmitted. The island of Lindisfarne itself was sacked by Vikings in 793 AD. The attack that traditionally marks the beginning of the Viking Age in Britain, and the monks fled with their treasures, carrying the Gospels to safety. The Gospels survived. They travelled with the monks through decades of wandering, protecting the remains of St. Cuthbert, until they eventually came to rest in Durham Cathedral, where they remained for centuries. They were subjected to an attempt to wash a carpet page with seawater by a later monk who thought the waterproof ink was dirt. They were annotated with an Old English gloss, an interlinear translation of the Latin text into Anglo-Saxon, written between the lines of the original, possibly by a monk named Aldred in the 10th century, making the Lindisfarne Gospels the oldest surviving translation of the Gospels into English. They are now in the British Library, where they are kept in controlled conditions and displayed under glass. They have been fully digitized, and the digital facsimile can be examined in extraordinary detail online. And they still look like something no ordinary human being could have made. Section 31. The Cheddar Man and What He Tells Us About Deep Time. In 1903, during excavations in Gough's Cave in the Cheddar Gorge of Somerset, workers found a human skull and associated skeleton. The bones were ancient. Radiocarbon dating has since established their age at approximately 10,000 years, placing them firmly in the Mesolithic period in the centuries immediately following the last ice age. The individual, who became known as Cheddar Man, was a hunter-gatherer who lived at the edge of the post-glacial world when Britain was still connected to the continent, and when the animals that grazed the Paleolithic landscapes were only beginning to be replaced by the fauna of the more temperate world we know today. For most of the 20th century, Cheddar Man sat in storage at the Natural History Museum in London, his significance noted but not systematically interrogated. He was the oldest complete human skeleton found in Britain, and that was remarkable, but the technology to learn much more about him did not exist. Then, in 2018, a team from the Natural History Museum and the University of Huddersfield conducted the first ancient DNA analysis of Cheddar Man's remains, extracting genetic material from a small bone within his ear. The results were reported widely because they were unexpected. Cheddar Man, the oldest known Briton, had dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. The genetic profile that produces this combination, dark pigmentation in the skin, combined with light pigmentation in the irises, is ancestral for humans in general. The mutations that produce pale skin in European populations are relatively recent, driven by evolutionary pressure in environments with low UV radiation combined with heavy reliance on grain-based agriculture, which provides little vitamin D, requiring the body to synthesize it from sunlight. These mutations appear to have spread primarily in the Neolithic period, associated with the incoming farming populations who displaced or absorbed the dark-skinned Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. So the Mesolithic Britons, the original post-glacial inhabitants of Britain, were almost certainly dark-skinned in general, with the kind of pigmentation typical of modern populations in warmer environments. Cheddar Man's specific genetic profile confirms this for one individual. The pigmentation data from ancient DNA has been one of the more culturally significant findings of the ancient DNA revolution, because it challenges a particular narrative that treats pale skin as the default, the original, the ancestral state of the British population. It is not. The pale-skinned inhabitants of Britain are the result of subsequent waves of immigration, genetic mixing, and evolutionary selection. The original Britons, the people who walked into Britain as the ice retreated, looked different from the majority of modern British people. This is biological fact, established from the DNA of the people themselves, preserved in their ancient bones. It does not have political implications in itself. Genetics does not determine culture or value or identity. But it has implications for how we tell the story of who the British are and where they came from. One remarkable footnote to the Cheddar Man story. In 1996, a school teacher named Adrian Target, who taught at a school in Cheddar, agreed to give a DNA sample for a project that was testing the feasibility of comparing modern individuals with ancient remains from the local area. His mitochondrial DNA was compared to that extracted from Cheddar Man. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line from mother to child and is relatively stable over time. Adrian Target was found to be a direct maternal line descendant of Cheddar Man. He had been living and working in Cheddar, a few hundred meters from the cave where his ancestors' bones had lain for 10,000 years. He had walked past the cave regularly. He had no idea. And then a DNA test established that the continuous female line from Cheddar Man to Adrian Target, 10,000 years of mothers and daughters, had never entirely left the area. That is continuity. Real, biological, demonstrable continuity across 10,000 years, from a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer who hunted horses and deer across a post-glacial landscape to a 21st century schoolteacher with a mortgage and a car and a subscription to television streaming services. The deep time of British prehistory is not entirely abstract. It runs through the bodies of people alive today. Section 32. The Thornborough Henges. Britain's Orrin alignment in North Yorkshire. 3 massive henge monuments are arranged in a line running northwest to southeast across a stretch of agricultural land. The Thornborough Henges, as they are collectively known, are not the most famous prehistoric monuments in Britain. They lack the dramatic stone settings of Stonehenge or the landscape scale of Avebury. They are earthwork monuments, banks and ditches, mostly visible now as crop marks and earthwork traces in a landscape that has been intensively farmed for centuries. But their arrangement has attracted a very specific kind of attention. The 3 Thornborough Henges are not perfectly aligned. They make a very slight curve, the middle henge offset slightly from the straight line between the other 2. This specific arrangement, 3 objects with a slightly offset central element, matches the arrangement of the belt stars of Orion, one of the most distinctive and culturally universal constellations in the sky. Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, the 3 stars of Orion's belt, are arranged in exactly this way, 3 in a line, with the central star slightly offset from the straight. Is this coincidence, or is it intentional, a deliberate terrestrial mapping of a celestial pattern? The alignment of terrestrial monuments with stellar patterns is a claim that requires careful evaluation. There are many sets of 3 monuments in Britain and many sets of 3 stars in the sky. The probability that some of the former accidentally match some of the latter is not negligible. Critics of the Orion-Thornborough connection make this statistical point. You can find alignments if you look hard enough, because there are enough data points on both the terrestrial and the celestial side to generate accidental matches. The defenders of the alignment respond by pointing to supporting evidence. The henges are each very large, each approximately 240 meters in diameter and consistent in size. The construction of three monuments of identical size in an arrangement that specifically matches a distinctive stellar pattern rather than forming a simple straight line or random scatter argues against pure coincidence. There is also the question of Orion's significance. The Pleiades star cluster, whose appearance in the night sky was used to mark the agricultural calendar across many ancient cultures, is in the same region of the sky as Orion. Orion itself, rising and setting at specific times of year, could have served as a calendar marker, and Orion's belt is one of the most distinctive and universally recognized stellar patterns in the night sky, one of the few that virtually all cultures from all over the world have identified and named. Whether the Thornborough connection is genuine or coincidental, the henges themselves are remarkable. The earliest is dated to around 3500 BC, making it older than Stonehenge. The surrounding landscape shows evidence of earlier activity, including Neolithic long barrows, suggesting this area was significant for centuries before the henges were built. The henges were used for an extended period and show evidence of modification and repair. A further detail of the Thornborough henges complicates the picture in an interesting way. Examination of the henge banks has revealed that they were originally surfaced with gypsum, a white mineral that would have made the banks gleam in sunlight. The original appearance of the Thornborough henges was not the green earthworks we see today, but gleaming white rings against the landscape, visible from far greater distances and in conditions of lower light. White, gleaming, in a landscape where the chalk downs of Wiltshire are famous for the brilliant white of freshly cut chalk exposed in earthwork construction. Silbury Hill, gleaming white. The Avebury banks gleaming white. The banks of Stonehenge gleaming white when newly cut. There is a pattern of deliberate visual impact in Neolithic monument construction that we miss because the original surfaces have weathered to green in the subsequent millennia. Seen as they were originally meant to be seen, white rings gleaming on a green landscape, the Thornborough henges would have been dramatic landmarks, visible from the surrounding lowlands, marking the significant place with unmistakable visual presence. Whether they mapped Orion or not, they were statements of presence and power, visible to anyone who moved through the landscape of North Yorkshire 4,000 years ago. Section 33. The problem of the ancient genetic ghost. In 2015, analysis of ancient DNA from Mesolithic and Neolithic skeletons across Europe produced an unexpected ghost. Researchers found a genetic ancestry component in ancient European populations that did not match any known ancient group. Not the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, not the Anatolian farmers, not the steppe populations. It appeared to have contributed to various ancient populations, particularly those of Eastern Europe and the Near East, but its source was not identified. This unknown genetic ancestry was provisionally called Ancient North Eurasian and associated with a partly reconstructed population whose full genome has since been partially recovered from Siberian specimens. But there is a component of European ancient DNA, sometimes called basal Eurasian, that appears to represent a very ancient, relatively isolated population that contributed genetics to later European populations before these populations are clearly attested in the archaeological record. What this means for Britain specifically is that the population history of the British Isles is even more complex than the three-wave model. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age steppe people suggests. There are ancestral ghosts in the British genome, populations that contributed genetically but have not been identified and may never be, because either their remains have not been found or have not been analysed, or they lived and died in places we have not yet sampled adequately. The ancient DNA revolution has opened up enormous new insight into the population history of Britain and Europe, but it has simultaneously revealed how much more complexity there is than anyone initially suspected. Every new dataset produces new questions. Every new sample suggests another unidentified population, another missing link, another ghost. Britain's population history is not a simple story of who came first and who came next. It is a palimpsest of overlapping ancestries, replacements, admixtures, and survivals that a century of archaeology could not reveal, but that a decade of ancient DNA analysis has begun to sketch out. What we have is not yet the full picture. The full picture is much more complex. For the living inhabitants of Britain, this complexity is ancestrally real. Every person in Britain carries genetic material from populations that lived in dramatically different ways, at dramatically different times. Some of them no longer identifiable as distinct groups. A British person's genome is an archive of the entire population history of northwestern Europe, written in the four-letter alphabet of DNA, carrying traces of hunter-gatherers and farmers, of steppe nomads and coastal traders, of people whose names we will never know and whose languages we will never speak. That is who the British are, genetically. A library of deep time, a walking record of everything that has ever come to these islands and stayed. Section 34. The Stone of Destiny and the Politics of Archaeology. In 1296, Edward III of England invaded Scotland, defeated the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar, and removed from Scone Abbey a large block of sandstone that had been used in the coronation of Scottish kings for centuries. He took it to Westminster Abbey, incorporated it into the coronation throne, and English and then British monarchs were crowned over it for the next 700 years. The Stone of Scone, also called the Stone of Destiny, was returned to Scotland in 1996, where it now rests in Edinburgh Castle. It was temporarily returned to Westminster Abbey for the coronation of Charles III in 2023. But what is the Stone of Destiny, and how old is it really? The Scottish tradition holds that the stone is the pillow on which Jacob rested his head when he dreamed of the ladder to heaven, and that it was brought to Scotland via Egypt, Spain, and Ireland in remote antiquity. This is obviously legendary. The actual origin of the stone has been the subject of archaeological and geological analysis. The stone is red sandstone of a type geologically consistent with the old red sandstone formation of the Scone area itself. In other words, it almost certainly came from Scone or its immediate vicinity. This does not rule out an early medieval origin, but it does not support any exotic provenance narrative. The precise date of when the stone began to be used in Scottish coronation ceremonies is uncertain, but it appears to be no earlier than the 9th or 10th century AD. The historical record of its use begins in the 12th century with reasonable reliability. There is, however, a persistent and long-standing claim that Edward III got the wrong stone. The tradition holds that the monks of Scone, forewarned of the English invasion, hid the real Stone of Destiny and replaced it with a plain block of sandstone, which is what Edward took to London. The real stone, on this account, is still somewhere in Scotland, hidden by the monks and never recovered. Archaeological investigations over the years have not found another stone, but the claim is not entirely without basis. The descriptions of the Stone of Destiny in pre-1296 sources suggest it may have been more ornate than the plain rectangular block that was taken to England, possibly decorated with carvings. The current stone is notably plain, lacking the decoration one might expect of an object of such cultural importance. The Stone of Destiny and its contested history illustrates the political dimension of archaeology in ways that purely prehistoric sites do not. What objects mean, who they belong to, what their history signifies. These questions are never purely technical. They carry weight in contemporary, cultural, and national identities. The repatriation of the stone to Scotland was a political act as well as a cultural one, acknowledging the long national significance of an object that had been removed by conquest. Similar questions attend many objects in British museums. The Elgin marbles from the Parthenon are the most famous example internationally, but the Benin bronzes, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the Lewis chessmen, 6 of which are in Scotland, the majority in the British Museum, all raise questions about what it means to possess an object, what obligations possession entails, and when historical removal constitutes theft to be remedied. These are not purely archaeological questions. They are ethical and political questions that archaeology makes unavoidable. Section 35. The Whitby Whale and the Unexpected Connections in the coastal town of Whitby in North Yorkshire, which most people know as the town where Dracula arrived in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, and as the site of a ruined medieval abbey. There is a museum that contains an object whose story is considerably stranger than anything in vampire fiction. In the 1960s, during building work in Whitby, a carved sperm whale's tooth was found in a deposit associated with the medieval abbey. The carving was unusual. It depicted a stylized face in a manner that was recognized as being characteristic of Inuit or Dorset culture art from the Eastern Arctic. The object was eventually identified as a piece of pre-Columbian Arctic ivory carving, likely made by people of the Dorset culture of Arctic Canada, possibly before 1000 AD. How did an Arctic carved ivory object end up in a medieval English abbey? The most straightforward explanation involves the Norse. Norse expansion in the North Atlantic from the late 9th century onward brought Scandinavian settlers to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually Vinland in North America. The Norse Greenlanders traded with and occasionally encountered the Dorset culture people of the Eastern Arctic, whom they called Skraelings. Objects passed between the two cultures, sometimes through trade and sometimes through other kinds of contact that the Norse sagas politely omit. From Greenland, Norse trading networks connected back to Scandinavia and to the wider European commercial world. An Arctic ivory object could have travelled from Canada to Greenland to Norway to England, carried as an exotic curiosity or traded for its ivory content. The Abbey at Whitby was a wealthy religious institution with connections across the medieval world. The arrival of an exotic object from the far north would not have been impossible or even particularly unusual. But the specific nature of the Whitby object, its Inuit-style carving rather than being a lump of raw ivory, suggests it arrived as a finished object rather than raw material, which in turn suggests it was valued as an artifact as well as for its material content. Someone found it interesting as a made thing, not just as ivory. This object is a physical trace of a connection between the indigenous peoples of Arctic Canada and medieval England that nobody would have predicted and that the written historical record does not explicitly support. It is the kind of find that reminds us that the medieval world was more connected, more curious about the wider world, and more engaged in long-distance exchange than the standard narratives of the period suggest. Britain was never isolated. From the Neolithic period onward, it was connected to Europe, to the Mediterranean, to Scandinavia, and through Scandinavian intermediaries to the wider world. The Whitby whale tooth is an extreme example of a normal pattern, objects moving through networks of exchange and curiosity across distances and cultures that, in retrospect, seem surprising, but that reflect the fundamental human drive to make connections and maintain relationships across distance. Section 36. The final question. What Britain's hidden archaeology tells us about ourselves. We have covered, in the course of this documentary, a span of time from the Mesolithic period, 10,000 years ago, to the medieval period, approximately 1,000 years ago. We have looked at wooden roads and submerged landscapes, at astronomical alignments and genetic ghosts, at severed heads and Viking parasites, at Roman cursing tablets and Pictish symbols without a key. What does all of this add up to? There is a temptation, at the end of a journey through the deep history of Britain, to offer a simple synthesis. A narrative, something that ties all the threads together and produces a satisfying conclusion. This temptation should be resisted because the archaeology of Britain resists simple conclusions. What the archaeology shows, consistently and over again, is that the people who came before us were as intelligent as we are, as emotionally complex, as capable of beauty and organization, and cruelty and spirituality. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were not working toward us, improving with each generation until they arrived at the superior endpoint of modern civilization. They were people, living in the present tense of their own lives, solving the problems of their own worlds with the tools and knowledge they had available. Some of those tools we have subsequently improved on. We have metals that Bronze Age smiths would have found miraculous. We have communication technologies that would baffle a Neolithic monument builder. We have medicines that would have seemed like witchcraft to a Roman soldier stationed at Hadrian's Wall. But some of the knowledge they had, we have lost. The specific astronomical observations embedded in the orientation of the passage tombs, the tradition of oral history that maintained the significance of sacred places across generations without writing, the relationship with the landscape that made specific stones from specific places worth moving hundreds of miles, the ability to maintain a measurement standard across vast distances and long periods of time without institutional infrastructure, the system of symbols on the Pictish stones. Whatever it was, we have not simply improved, we have traded. We have gained capabilities that were unimaginable to our ancestors, and in the process we have lost things that they possessed that we cannot quite reconstruct. This is not a counsel of despair or a romanticism of the past. It is an honest assessment of what the archaeological record shows. The past is not a single direction of travel. It is a complex set of possibilities, most of them not realized, most of the paths not taken, most of the knowledge accumulated painfully over centuries eventually lost. Britain's hidden archaeology keeps reminding us of this. Every new discovery, every inverted tree in a Norfolk marsh, every aligned passage tomb in Orkney, every skull deposit in an Iron Age hill fort, every Pictish stone carving that will not reveal its meaning, is a reminder that the past was more varied, more complex, and more interesting than we had previously imagined. And that is the thing about hidden archaeology. It is hidden until it isn't. The sweet track was in the peat for 6,000 years before Ray Sweet's machine struck it. The Staffordshire hoard was in the ground for 14 centuries, before Terry Herbert's metal detector found it. Doggerland was under the North Sea for 6,000 years before seismic surveys revealed it. The Warren Field pits were invisible for 8,000 years before crop marks gave them away. There is more. There is vastly, overwhelmingly more. Still in the ground, still in the peat, still on the seafloor. The proportion of Britain's archaeological record that has been excavated, analysed, published, and made available for understanding is a small fraction of what exists. Britain is an island built on layered time. Every field has something underneath it. Every riverbed carries the discards and offerings of generations. Every hillside was shaped by hands and purposes we are only beginning to appreciate. This country has been people's home for at least 10,000 years, and probably longer. With a gap during the worst of the last ice age, when the ice sheets covered most of the island and made permanent habitation impossible. 10,000 years of people building, moving, burying, offering, carving, burning, farming, mining, trading, worshipping, arguing, loving, dying. 10,000 years of activity, most of it invisible, most of it gone without material trace. But some of it, enough of it, preserved in ways we keep finding. We are at the beginning of understanding what happened here. Every generation of archaeologists finds things that surprise the previous one. Every new technology, from dendrochronology to ancient DNA to ground-penetrating radar, to optically stimulated luminescence dating reveals layers of the past that were inaccessible before. The story keeps getting more complex. The people keep getting more interesting. The mysteries keep multiplying even as individual questions get answered. And that is not a frustration. That is the most important thing archaeology does for us. It keeps reminding us that the world is larger and older and stranger and richer than we know. If you have watched this far, you already know that. You came for the stories that don't fit, the discoveries that shouldn't exist, the moments when the past reaches through the present and shakes us by the collar and says, "Pay attention." This is more complicated than you thought. Thank you for paying attention. Subscribe, because there is more where this came from. Much more, and the stories keep getting stranger. The Earth keeps giving up its secrets, and we will be here when it does. Now click a video. There is so much more to know.